Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us on your Saturday morning. My name is Scott Kleinrock. I'm the Conservation Programs Manager here at the Waterwise Community Center, and I am looking forward to presenting today's workshop to you, Favorite Plants for Inland Valley Gardens. Just a quick note before we get started. You can download all of the slides in this presentation. So there's a lot of slides with a lot of reference information about our specific favorite plants. And so if you would like to, anytime now or after the workshop, you can go to the top URL on the screen right here, cbwcd.org/presentations. And I will type that into the chat right now, just so it's in the log. If you don't have a pen handy, it's cbwcd.org/presentations. And so at cbwcd.org/presentations, that's just a list of links to the PDF downloads of all of the slides of all of the online classes that we do. So if you find the Favorite Plants for Inland Valley Garden link, you can right click and click Save File As, and then you'll be able to download all of the slides that you're going to see today. As well, you can rewatch this workshop on our YouTube page. If you go to cbwcd.org/YouTube, the second link on the page here that I'm going to type into the chat right now, /YouTube, that'll take you directly to our past workshop recording playlist. And so eventually, this recording from today will probably be edited and put up there. However, right now you can see the recording of the last time I presented this workshop. So all the same slides, mostly all the same stuff that we are going to talk about. So if you want to review or the reference, you can do that as well. And so with that, we will get going on today's workshop. Quickly, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the organization that I am from. We are the Waterwise Community Center. Our technical name of our public agency is the Chino Basin Water Conservation District. And the Waterwise Community Center is the public-facing outreach of what we do. We are a special district, so similar kind of to a school district or a fire district. It was created by a public vote in 1949 to provide water conservation services, essentially to the western edge of San Bernardino County. So we don't provide anybody's water to properties, but we work very closely with the local water providers on water conservation services. And we say our mission is threefold: to percolate, to demonstrate, and to educate. Percolation, as you can see here on the right, has sort of long been the bread and butter of what our agency does. We own and operate in coordination with a number of local water agencies, a number of large-scale what are called infiltration basins. Essentially, they're big pits in the ground. Most of them are literally old gravel pits that were kind of revamped and re-engineered to take in water from our channelized creek systems in our local area. So water that would otherwise just leave our communities. And we capture that water as it trickles down. It's cleaned through natural processes as it goes down through the sands and the gravels, and recharges our local groundwater table, which is really important because we rely on about 60% local water supply, and our agency essentially exists to help preserve that local water supply and protect it. However, that's just part of what we do, because that's how we kind of help with the supply side of water conservation. We're also very active on what we call the demand side of water conservation. So how we're actually using this water in our communities. And so to that end, we have a free, beautiful public demonstration garden at our headquarters facilities in Montclair. It's just under 3 acres of demonstration landscapes showing all sorts of different approaches that you can take, whether it's at a residential space or a space in the community. We have the vast majority of the plants that we are going to talk about today, if not all of them, most likely all of them. And that is free and open to the public 6 days a week from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. every day except Sunday, closed on major holidays as well. So please come check us out. We have lots of comfortable places to sit, free Wi-Fi. So come spend some time. And then we also do lots of education for all sorts of different groups, from free public workshops like this Starting in the new year, we are going to start to get back into our demonstration garden some. We've been on pause for all of our in-person programs for quite a while due to COVID, but we're going to start doing some kind of outside in the garden workshops, and are looking forward to working with people back in the garden again. And we also do lots of curriculum integrated programs for K through 12 students, as well as professional development for landscape professionals. The easiest thing to do to keep up with everything that we are doing, including if you are in our local service area on the western edge of San Bernardino County, are free one-on-one programs for you, whether it's helping you understand your irrigation system, how your sprinklers and timers should be set, or helping with design, which we'll talk about later, is to sign up for our newsletter, as well as check out our main website. So I'll type a few more links into the chat. If you go to cbwcd.org, that'll get you to our main website, learn more about us and our programs. And then our newsletter, which is just one email a month. We don't share your email address with anyone else. No junk, just kind of what we have going on with all of our programs and upcoming workshops is cbwcd.org/newsletter. So if you don't get that already, I highly encourage you to sign up for that and keep in touch. And so before we jump into the content, I want to tell you just a little bit about who I am and why I'm talking to you about this. For those of you who just joined us, my name is Scott Kleinrock. I'm the Conservation Programs Manager here at the Waterwise Community Center. And what I do is basically landscape and horticulture. I come from a background, formal training in landscape architecture, as well as many years of working in various aspects of horticulture, starting with maintenance, design, construction management, maintenance management, all sorts of different things. Before I came over to the Waterwise Community Center, I worked for 8 years in the public gardens world. But what I'm really passionate about is working with normal people, homeowners, our local community members, and helping support projects, whether it's do-it-yourself, which I'm a huge fan of, or helping people work with contractors and know what they want and what to ask for. That's really what I love doing. So I love this work at the Waterwise Community Center. And I'm really excited to present this workshop to you because if you've been joining us for our past workshops we've been doing through the season, we've had workshops that talk about design, workshops that talk about construction. And in a lot of those workshops, I say we're talking about the principles here. And some of them I've taught you how to do your research and figure out what plants you're interested in. But in those workshops, we don't really have time to talk too much individually about here's what's great about this plant. Here's what I love about that plant. Here's a great plant for this situation. That's what this workshop is going to be all about. We'll be telling you about what I think should be the top kind of go-to plants for our region. And so that's a little bit about me and what we are going to be doing. And then now, lastly, before we get going, I am going to launch a very quick opening poll that you will see coming up in your window. Please take just a minute to fill that out. That gives us some kind of metrics information for our programs that we need to track to keep things going. And then the last question is what I'm most interested in. Tells me a little bit about where you are starting from in whatever space you are thinking about in terms of what plants you're currently working with. And then we'll jump right into it. Thanks, everybody. Thank you very much for those of you who are finishing up. And please, let us know where you are joining us from in the chat if you're not from one of those local areas. And everyone is very welcome, but that's very helpful. For those of you who are not in California, so somebody is from Florida, please note that this is a workshop focused on Southern California. So Florida, if you're thinking about a property in California, it might be interesting, but the vast majority of plants are not going to do well in Florida. San Fernando Valley, exactly what we're talking about. Moreno Valley, exactly what we're talking about. Carlsbad, the plants that we are talking about will work coastally. They can also take the heat. Some of the desert plants, maybe not in Carlsbad unless you're in a really hot exposed area, but the vast majority of them, yes. Sierra foothills, some of these plants are grown up there and will do well. Some might not be frost tolerant enough. So I would say take what you learned today and combine it with some local knowledge. Maybe reach out to your local native plant society. If you don't have a background in that, there will be a local chapter of the California Native Plant Society. And just make sure that the plants you're interested in from today are going to work out well in those Sierra foothills. A number of them will. Okay, we will give just another second. Campbell, California, west of San Jose, same thing. Most of these are going to work very well in the Bay Area. Maybe not some of the true desert plants, unless it's a real hot, sunny area, but there's definitely very active, great native plant nurseries, as well as Native Plant Society up there to help you kind of select. And so we'll stop in just a second, just the last few that came in from the United Kingdom. Unless you are just intellectually interested in what we are talking about, these are plants for California. The vast majority of them will not work out well in the UK. And then for the person in Las Vegas, some of these will work. We talked about a few true desert plants. There's a couple of them that actually grow natively out in that area, but a lot of them are not going to totally, that Las Vegas summer heat is even hotter than here. So some of them will work, some of them might not. So definitely do your local research. Okay, if you haven't finished up the poll, that's just fine. Thank you, most of you, for responding. And let's see, just a couple of things. Okay, so a little less than half of you still have some turf or lawn. That number is dropping all of the time. And I'm not here to tell you got to get rid of your lawn. Our kind of thing at the Waterwise Community Center is if you don't use it, maybe you can do something more interesting with it that will take less of investment to maintain. About half of you already have some general Waterwise plants. Over a third of you California native plants. That number is steadily growing, which I'm really excited to see. And we're going to talk a lot about native plants, not exclusively, but a lot about some of the top native plants for home gardens today. About half of you have succulents. Half of you have fruit trees, which makes sense. Almost a third of you veggie beds. We have some gardening enthusiasts here. And then some of you higher water ornamentals as well. Thank you very much. Cool. And last response to the poll comments coming in from the chat. Sorry about that. I'm switching some windows around. Here is from Anna. Reminds me that some people who are gardening enthusiasts like to attend local events from different areas to see what gardening is like there, which is awesome. You'll see kind of what I think the direction of gardening is starting to go and should go in Southern California. And then last, from the person who just chatted in from inland San Diego area, that's going to be very similar to where we are. So the vast majority of these plants will be good for you. Okay, thank you so much, everybody. Let's jump into it. Quickly, how to interact with me today and ask questions. So for comments coming in, the chat is great. But if you have actual questions, which I encourage you to type in at any time, and then what I will do is to keep the flow of the workshop going, kind of in between sections, I'll stop and answer all the questions that have come in. Please type those into the Q&A function. So you'll see you can select a couple of different boxes to pull up and type into in your Zoom interface. And so the one with two text bubbles that says Q&A, that's the one to ask me questions. On the back end, on my second screen that I'm not sharing, that keeps the questions much more organized for me, and I can kind of check off the ones that I've answered. Where in the chat, sometimes the questions get lost. to keep the flow of things going, we don't actually call on people and have them ask the questions with the audio. We find that there's a lot of downtime and technical issues with that. So please type your questions into the Q&A and let's get going. So just first off, for those of you who are just getting into it, this is not what we are talking about today. The person who did this probably had this go in with the best of intentions, but we have so many wonderful ways we can go in Southern California with our Waterwise landscapes that this is not what we are talking about. Big first idea is that evolving to low water landscapes is not a compromise at all. And in fact, most of the time, we can end up with landscapes that are much more interesting, much more beautiful, much more unique, and just take less water and resources to take care of. So that's the sort of plants and plantings and thoughts that we are going to talk about today. And so whether it's kind of an elegant, kind of simple landscape, like this one. I really love this picture. Some of you may have seen it in other workshops because it also shows, you know, I'm not saying you can't have any high water use plantings. Personally, for me at home, I love to grow fruit trees and vegetables in addition to native plants. And so I have some high water plantings, but those are worth it to me. This person I love, they have a high water hydrangea and a Japanese maple, but in the appropriate spot together in a shady corner where they can give just that spot extra irrigation. And the rest of the landscape is perfectly adapted to life in hot inland Southern California. So whether it's a colorful, more informal landscape, a desert landscape softened by some native and Mediterranean shrubs, a sheltering oak woodland inspired landscape, doesn't need to be something that is super high-end design. I really love this very informal landscape and just a patio space just right there in the wood chip mulch. This is a front yard in Altadena, of billowing, very wild and natural. And it doesn't need to be all or nothing. It's just fine to start small and gain confidence. If you know you're going to take out your whole lawn, then there are some efficiencies on the irrigation to doing at least a whole chunk at once. But it's also totally great to either start small and then go from there after you're successful. Or, you know, if you're using part of your front lawn for your dog or your kids like to go out and play soccer, that's fine too, but maybe think about how much of the space you need. And especially in a domestic space, kind of working with the edges is a great way to really make the experience of the lawn much more pleasant as well, instead of just lawn straight to the street or sidewalk. And so here's basically what we're going to talk about in today's workshop. We're going to provide a brief introduction to California native and water-wise plants. What are these things anyways? Talk a little bit about how to think about plants for your garden and where to research plants. And then we will really break down, the bulk of the workshop is just by category, my favorite plants for home gardens. Plants that can take full blasting sun, plants that are smaller plants, great along pathways, my favorite large trees, my favorite smaller scale patio trees, plants that are good for that funny north side of the house or north side of the garage where it's shady a lot of the year and then full blasting sun in summer. There's some great choices for that. And then at the very end, I'll show a slide for our local area, best places to get these great plants. And then if we have time, a bit about bringing it all together and next steps. And so sometimes we don't get through all of the slides on this workshop. It depends how many questions there are. But again, you can download the PDF. So if we don't get through all of the individual plant lists, you can read through them. But we'll get through just as much as we can, hopefully the whole thing. And so we'll start by, and then somewhere in there, we'll take a brief 5-minute break about halfway through. So let's start with the question, what is a water-wise plant? Because we're going to use that term a lot. Essentially, there is no technical definition. I like to use just the loose definition of plants that love life here. What do they have in common? Well, most of us in our yards will water them some. Most of them will need water. Even our water-wise plants will need water to get established. So they're going to be coming from the nursery situation in this very rich kind of potting soil mix, getting watered all the time, maybe being grown underneath shade cloth and then put in our yard. So we need to help them transition. So our water-wise plants are generally going to get watered once a week deeply their first year, which is called their establishment period. For those of you who want to learn more about that, we talk about it a lot in our installation and establishment of Waterwise and California Native Gardens class. You can check that recording on our YouTube channel. And then after that, you'll be tapering it off to 1 or 2 times a month, maybe every 3 weeks, just depending on the specific plants and your situation. And I will connect you with a resource that breaks that down for all of those plants. What else do they have in common? They probably do more for us than the plants they're replacing if they're replacing a conventional landscape. California natives tend to provide valuable habitat for pollinators, birds, and butterflies. If you're really interested in that, definitely check out our gardening for birds, pollinators, butterflies, and more workshop available on our YouTube page. We're also going to be teaching it in a few months, live online as well. And together, these Waterwise plants will make your yard an exciting place where something is always changing. Very different than a typical lawn landscape where you're trying to have it look the same and uniform year round. There's always something coming into bloom, always something changing, oftentimes attracting a new bird for a different season, especially with the California natives. If you want flowers in your landscape year round, you can make that happen because plants have kind of different growing cycles throughout the year. Another big idea for what are the plants that are adapted well to this area? Southern California, most of it, until you get out to the true desert in the east, but even the Inland Empire area where we are, is not a desert. Sometimes you hear people say, well, this area is a desert. It's a dry area. Technically, it's a semi-arid Mediterranean climate, maybe moving more towards an arid climate these days, but we're not a true desert. One of the big differences is that deserts get summer thunder showers, where the definition of a Mediterranean climate is our moisture comes in cool winters, and then we have hot, dry summers. Occasionally, we'll get a little sprinkle in the summer, but that's for the most part what defines our area. And our Waterwise and full sun-growing native plants that are adapted to that harsh, hot, dry deserts tend to have one or more of these adaptations. Gray or silver leaves that keep them a little bit cooler happen to be very striking visually to design with, as is evidenced in this Allen Chickering sage in this picture here, with that contrast with the darker leaf. Glossy or leathery leaves, so kind of a thicker coating on the leaf that helps hold on water. Example of that are our Manzanitas. So this Howard Mcminn Manzanita here on the right has a very thick leathery leaf. Fuzzy leaves, which that fuzz on them can also help prevent excessive sun. So a lot of our sages and especially some of our desert plants that we'll talk about have those fuzzy leaves. And then many of them have what I call sleepy summers. And so their ecological adaptation is to go a little bit dormant in the summer. And that's one of the reasons why even with Waterwise or native plants, most of us at home will still do watering once every 3 to 4 weeks after establishment in the summer, is because a lot of the times after they're well established, the plants can live through that, but they're going to kind of shrivel into themselves if they get no water at all. Some people garden that way, and that's just fine. It depends on the look that you are going for. And some plants in the garden will be just fine with that, especially sometimes the ones that are adapted to like really local native conditions. But a lot of people like to keep things looking a little bit nicer. And so we don't pump them full of water all of the time. That's not good for their health. But just every 3 or 4 weeks, just keeps them looking a little bit nicer, keeps them from going dormant. But that's kind of their adaptation. And that's why they don't need that much water in the summer. And many of these adaptations give the plant these very unique looks that are more fun to use in design than a lot of the conventional plants. Like if you think about roses. Roses, other than the flowers, are kind of a pretty ugly plant. And especially when they're not in bloom, they just don't do that much for us in the landscape. A lot of our Waterwise and native plants do so much for us. So here's an example from my front yard in the spring showing some of these adaptations. We have the ferny fuzzy leaf of the yarrow, which is not the most drought adapted. It kind of goes dormant and then will come back. And for the yarrow, I just kind of hit it with a hose in between my main waterings every couple of weeks or so to keep it from going dormant. In some areas, I kind of do let it go dormant and then it comes right back in the fall. Here you can see this is fragrant pitcher sage. This is the fuzz. It's really hard to get a picture of. It's probably one of my better ones, but those fuzzy leaves, if you see them when they're backlit, either in the morning, as the case is here, or in the afternoon, they literally glow. And even this picture doesn't fully capture how beautiful that can be. And so if we talk about, well, this area is not a desert, what is our local area? And this applies to most of non-desert California in the Mediterranean climate zones. In Southern California, we have these main plant communities. And not that you would necessarily want your yard to look like this, but getting some of our brief inspiration in our California Native Garden Design class, we talk about this a lot more. So definitely check that out if you haven't seen it. But here are some of our main local plant community types. Oak woodlands, not a desert, shady, sheltered, really no place I'd rather be on a summer day. Even our hot, dry slopes of the chaparral, look at that plant density, even in a wild area with no irrigation, and all sorts of variations of greens and grays. Oak savanna, which is trees dotting a grassland with seasonal wildflowers and occasional flowering shrubs, is probably my personal favorite in terms of where I like to be and where I find a lot of inspiration from. Simple landscape, but oh my gosh, so beautiful. So that is a picture at Santa Rosa Plateau, which is currently closed after a wildfire. I believe it's currently closed and in rehabilitation, but one of my favorite places to go hiking. And this is another picture from their meadow grassland. So here you see even our local cacti don't grow always in blasting desert conditions. So here we have grasses and wildflowers. And there's all sorts of other types. I also, even though we are not a desert, find a lot of inspiration in some of our desert plants, which grow really well in our kind of urban heat island areas. The full blasting sun next to a driveway, great place for a colorful desert plant. And so we'll talk about some of those. And so it is true that some of our wild local areas are suffering in this drought, but overall, these plants and plant communities are resilient. And so if you look at this slide kind of tracking historic droughts, you can see that even in our kind of recent droughts from the 2000s that feel like bad droughts, historically, if you look at kind of what the scientists look at to kind of look back into weather patterns, we've gone through these mega droughts where these communities of plants and species have survived. And so with a little bit of extra care at home, they're really built to survive quite well. And so if just one example of a spot that I used to hike at all the time when I lived in the San Gabriel Valley, and this was in the middle of our last big drought, on a west-facing, full-blasting afternoon, crack in the rock hillside, and you can see some of our native shrubs are still looking really good and green. So there are hundreds of well-adapted and beautiful plants to choose from. This is another part of my front yard. In the spring, all California native plants, you can see so much seasonal color in the spring, but still lots of color throughout the rest of the year. And so it's kind of the Wild West. Where do you even start is where a lot of people are kind of at. Do you just go to the nursery and start buying the plants that look good? If you are there right now, I'd say combine what you learned today, absolutely, with our design focus classes that you can check out on our YouTube channel, because we break down a lot of that. There are many things to think about, ideally, before you even choose your plant if you're doing a larger kind of renovation. If you're just kind of swapping out 2 or 3 things in a small planting area, maybe you don't need to go through all of that. But kind of where do you start? There's so many plants at the nursery. And it used to be pretty simple for the average homeowner. You're expected to have turf, maybe a couple of roses, maybe a kind of green sheared blob of a hedge, and maybe a shade tree. And that's pretty much what everyone did. And so now we have so many more exciting choices as we think about how to move towards more beautiful and more sustainable landscapes. But it doesn't mean we need to make this very complicated. And so I encourage you, unless you're someone who identifies as I'm a gardener and my thing that I like to do the most on the weekends is to spend time in my garden, keep it relatively simple. You don't need 172 different species unless you want them all. I say that so often, I'm just realizing that that's exactly what the next slide says. But that's kind of one of my mantras for talking to people about this. You can still keep it kind of simple. You can have what we find is that when I design an average front yard garden, depending on the size of it, for someone who just wants a nice garden, including all the different sizes of plants, normally end up with maybe 12 to 20 different plant selections total. You don't need 1,000 different plants. I can't emphasize that enough. And so what I find as I talk with community, we're kind of in search for that new default. We know that we want to move beyond the default being turf, roses, and a shade tree and a green blob of a hedge that gets sheared every other week. So what's next? Here's what I propose. I'm not someone who's going to say you should only plant California native plants. That's not how I garden at home, although my partner and I grow lots of California native plants. But what I propose is, as the default, why don't we stick with easy to grow, low water California native plants, which are some of the more beautiful ones for the home garden, as a great starting point, because they tend to be very low water. They tend to have great benefits for songbirds, butterflies, and pollinators. So let's start there. And then if there's a specific reason why you want to go somewhere else, do it. If you love succulents and that architectural shape, then go for it. Maybe mixing the two. If you love fruit trees or vegetable gardens, put them in where appropriate. But the backbone, the new default, I believe, just one proposal, can be these beautiful low water California native plants. And we have plants in that palette that fit most of the niches. If you need that shrub, you need that small accent plant, you need that area to sit down and have a picnic on every once in a while, we'll talk about all of those options. So here it is. You don't need 172 different plants unless you want them all. Okay, so where do you start? Get inspired, look around. I'll share some resources with you. Take pictures of landscapes you like. Consider what you want, but also consider what you want to maintain. So for example, my front yard, pretty low maintenance, kind of designed to mimic kind of a native woodland area as it grows in. My backyard, my partner and I are both native horticulture people. So we have literally over 250 different species and cultivars of native plants. Even though those individual plants are mostly very low maintenance, that is not a low maintenance landscape overall. There's a lot of individual things to consider. Only do something like that if gardening is what you want to do every weekend, pretty much. Other than that, keep it simple. Think about your goals for the garden space overall, the feel, the look that you want, other than individual plants. And again, our design workshops talk a lot about that. Do some research on your plants and plan, and then build it. And we're here to help you with other resources. The research and planning part is just so essential. I have this conversation with so many people, just had it with someone 2 days ago, who think they don't have a green thumb. They buy plants and they die. If you are a person who thinks you don't have a green thumb, let me let you in on the secret. There's no such thing as a green thumb. When I ask people who have trouble growing plants, who think they just don't have a green thumb or don't really understand it, when you buy a plant, or better than that, before you buy a plant, do you quickly look at the plant needs, what it wants in terms of sun, water, soil, drainage? Does it need well-drained soil? Do you have well-drained soil? We'll talk a little bit about that, but definitely our other workshops that support this workshop talk a lot about it. Do you look up how the maintenance needs? Even low maintenance plants often want just a little bit of cleanup pruning once a year or so. And the season of that for some plants, even if they come from a similar place, wants to be in the fall, some wants to be in the spring. And inevitably, the people who think they don't have a green thumb don't do any of that. And the people who do well with plants pretty reliably either do that or have friends or people in their life that have done that, and so they can learn from them. And we have online resources for that. So please do that. Combine what you learned today with that. Plants are the most exciting part of a garden renovation project for many people, but they're only part of the formula for success. And so here are the links. You can check out our online upcoming workshops like this. Quick link that just goes to our Eventbrite at cbwcd.org/waterwise workshops, or so you don't need to necessarily wait till we teach it again. All the other workshops I reference are on demand on our YouTube page. And if you scroll to the top of the chat, you will see that. link, and that will get you right to our workshop specific playlist on our YouTube page. So here's exactly what I just talked about: sun or shade, soil type, drainage, irrigation frequency, for thinking about what's going to work well in a group in our landscape and in our design classes, as well as there's another class called selecting, purchasing, and planting Waterwise in California native plants. We really break down exactly what do we mean by fuller part sun, by shade. How do you understand your soil drainage? How do you do a simple drainage test just by digging a hole and working with a hose and timing it? And what do the results mean? We don't have the time to get into that in this workshop. That's why we have that other workshop. So check that all out. And then after that, we can also start thinking about other aspects of design, including leaf color, texture, shape, structure, form, density, thinking about bark color. And visual design often relies on contrast. So especially with our Waterwise plants and native plants, light foliage plants next to darker foliage plants, ferny leaf plants next to broader leaf plants, and then repetition, not one of this and one of that, but by thinking through that. And again, the design class are the ones to really kind of break all of that down. So take a look at those. The rest of this class, we're going to focus on plants. And so here are some of the specific workshops and a couple of other things I will share with you before we jump into all of those plant lists and talk about individual plants. If you are within our local service area, which means if you get your water from either Chino Hills, Cucamonga Valley Water District, Monte Vista Water District, Ontario, Fontana, or Upland, you can qualify for our no-cost landscape design assistance program, where our staff will design for you either a Waterwise front yard or a backyard. It's no cost, but we do ask for a $100 fully refundable deposit if after getting your design, you put in a Waterwise garden in that space within a year. You start by choosing a design style from different themes that we have. We always customize and bring in additional plants for your specific garden, but that gives us a starting point to really make the most of our time together. We work with you, tell you exactly what we need, but you send us measurements of your yard, photos of the site, and then we kind of prepare a base map and then have an online screen sharing meeting over Zoom, and we design your yard together. So full details for that, if you are in one of those specific areas where you get your water from those providers, is at cbwcd.org/design assistance. And here's just one example. This obviously comes with a key and other supporting information. This is a native design we did for a program participant in Chino Hills. And then, as I've talked about, we have resources for plant information. This is the website that we created called the Inland Valley Garden Planner to help people figure this out and get more details about all of these plants. Every plant covered today has a profile here, so you can use this as your next step and to plan more. So this is the Inland Valley Garden Planner website, inlandvalleygardenplanner.org, and there are a few things here. In order to get to plants, well, if you learn about a plant today and you just want to search for it and get more information directly, you can use the search function. The two other main sections of this website, and you can scroll down and check out the other information. The two main sections of this website are our plant finder and the design section. So for the plant finder, this is a searchable database. So if you know that you, for example, want to select a shrub that's California native, has low water needs, it's an area that's going to be, let's say, partial sun, because that's harder to figure out than full sun sometimes. And so that'll get you from our top 350 or so plants for this area for home gardens down to 20. Maybe that's enough for you to select from. But then what if you also want to be something that's good for butterflies? That gets you down to 5, really starts to select it down. Or birds and wildlife. That's actually 20, because all of those 20 are good for birds and wildlife. And so that can kind of help you select. If you want to create a profile, log in, you can do that. We don't share your email address when you do that to anyone else. It just lets you be able to save plant lists. And we are about to, in the next few months, have some great improvements on the back end of that make it clear for saving multiple lists, which you can do. So ideas for your front yard, your backyard, your grandma's house, any of that. Each one of these, you can get the basic info, but each one of these, then you can get a detailed description where you see photos of the different things the plant does. So far away, flowers, fruit on this one, because it's a native cherry. The birds love the cherries. And then a description, the basic plant properties. So you can know, we talk in the other workshops a lot about right plant, right place. What does it need in terms of sun, soil, height and width to expect, water needs, so you can learn how to group plants together. Water needs tend to be confusing for people, so we have more information about how to understand that. And then for all of these, you also, even if they're very low maintenance plants, need to know if and what you need to do, so you can get the maintenance information for all of them. So I highly encourage you to read that. You can copy and paste this information and encourage you to make your own kind of little maintenance calendar or maintenance guide for yourself with the information that we have. If this is also feeling kind of overwhelming to select individual plants, or you want to just get a good basis, so for 8 different themes, which we kind of selected by working with people in our local area and finding out what they are interested in, we created these sort of design templates. And so, for example, a lot of people are interested in, as long as they're going to go water-wise, maybe they can have something that attracts butterflies and songbirds. And so if you start there, you can go to our butterfly and songbird garden template, where we have created these design plans for 4 different sizes of yards. And you can go through these kind of visualizations that have labeled and unlabeled versions of them. Some of them, we're working on finishing. The rest of these have pop-up ones where you can click on these and it immediately just launches the plant profile. We're still finishing up those and getting those uploaded, and a couple of different views. And then if you like that look, we also have, so you can actually see the plant spacing, and these are actually printable, and you can measure them out if you want, or you can just use the icons as the guide, kind of see, to get that look, how these plants might go together, or examples of, even within that list, kind of plant combinations that we like. And even if you don't have, for example, an extra large yard, and those, we build these little patio spaces that maybe for your medium-sized backyard you'd want to emulate. And so if you have a medium yard or even a quite small yard, how can you work with these plants along the desired theme? And then all of those kind of bird's eye view plans, so you can really see the plant spacing and how it came together. You can get the full plant list to see them all. And these, we made them really simple. So for example, just 1 or 2 trees, a coordinated list of shrubs, smaller plants. There's tons of great plants that can be added to all of these, but people just kind of really wanted a simple, coordinated, easy place to start. And then kind of a irrigation schedule that will work for all of these plants together. So there's a lot more to explore here, but this is here to support kind of taking what we talked about today and going to that next level. In addition, I am almost done. I keep thinking it's only a few weeks away. It's hopefully going to be sometime in January, though the final editing is taking longer than I hoped. Almost done on a series of what will be 11 videos, kind of going through the entire design process step by step, where you can kind of really see how to use this, how to think about your own space, how to draw a base map to scale on graph paper, and really create your own garden design using all the resources here. So if you want to get the announcement for when that is going to be available on this site, sign up for the newsletter. But we're sort of getting close to being able to launch all of that. Okay, and with that, we're going to jump back to the presentation and really start working through the lists. Okay, so with this, let's break it down with, this is just one suggestion. So anyone else would, I'm sure, have a different list, but this is my suggestion of that new basic kind of where to start plant palette based on my favorites and the plants, some of them that I think maybe most residential yards, especially in this area, should have. And probably no one will have all of these, but a really great starting list to choose from. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the largest and longest lived plants. Trees are hopefully going to be the longest lived plants in the yard. They'll create shade over time and will have the largest impact of any of the plants in the garden because they can kind of establish their own microclimate. We're going to talk about some great large trees, but a lot of people feel like they don't have room for a huge tree in their yard. So we'll start by talking about small trees, sometimes called patio scale trees. Most front yards or backyards should have, I believe, at least one small tree. In hot inland Southern California, if you don't have shade, outside is not a pleasant place to be. And so I spent a lot of time trying to convince homeowners that yes, they do want trees. A small tree will not break an otherwise well-built or decent conditioned patio, will not break concrete, especially because you shouldn't plant right at the edge of it anyways, a few feet off. Small tree is not going to break a wall. It's not going to break a sewer line. No trees will break a sewer line generally that is in good condition. Any tree will send its roots into an old leaky sewer line. So things to think about with trees. And one of the nice things about small trees is you'll never have to hire someone to climb way up into the tree with the rope and harness. These things can be maintained either by you or by someone you hire, it's like from the ground with a pole pruner at the most. And so here are my favorite trees for our local area. Starting with desert willow. This is one that is an actual true desert plant, but grows so well here in inland Southern California in our non-desert areas. I have this next to my patio space in my backyard. We have a lot of them here at the Waterwise Community Center. And I've seen these growing natively, no irrigation at all, not planted, just growing wild, like off the side of the highway near Red Rocks outside of Las Vegas. So, they take that kind of heat and they grow just where the rain runoff, when it does rain from the highway strips, accumulates right on the edge. They appreciate a little bit of extra water. They natively grow kind of like not down in the stream, but kind of along streams or where there's a little bit more water in the hot blasting desert, but do just so well for us here inland. They do really well if you put like a dry stream bed in your backyard. They do really well next to, but not in the dry stream bed, kind of emulates where they grow naturally in the desert. So I have mine like right at the edge of a dry stream bed, but where it also will cast shade as it grows in more on a patio space, and it just loves life there. One of the really cool things about it is it has a really long bloom season. It's kind of like if it's hot, it's blooming. So a very long spring through most of summer bloom season. And this is one, we have one right at the edge of our west-facing parking lot. And when we get those occasional like 113-degree heat waves, when even some of our local native plants are looking not at their best, this thing just puts out more flowers. It's just in its element. Those flowers look like little orchids. They're gorgeous. The color, depending on the one you get, can range from this deep color. This is a cultivar called Burgundy, to just the normal range is almost white through pinks to about as deep as this. There is actual cultivar that you could find called Burgundy Desert Willow if you want to ensure you have the dark color. And they are deciduous, so they do lose their leaves in the winter, which if you're using it to shade a patio space or maybe shade the hot south or west facing portion of the house, can actually be kind of nice because it'll let a little bit more sun in the winter. So that's desert willow. Naturally gets bigger than this. It'll be a 20 to maybe 25 foot. Really wants to be a giant shrub, but what you can do is as it grows, you can just kind of prune out pretty easily some of the lower branches and have it be more tree-like if you want to kind of prune it up and be able to kind of have more shade and room underneath. Sometimes they're sold as individual like single trunk, like formal trees, but they really do best as a low trunk or multi-trunk tree. The single trunk trees tend to just lean over time because they really want to be more of a balanced multi-trunk kind of plant. Had a question come in. Great question, Don. Will these plants do well in the heavy Chino Hills clay or clay soil, wherever you have? Some of you are joining us from more coastal areas, a lot of clay out there. A lot of them will, and some of them won't. And so what you want to do is on the Inland Valley Garden Planner, look at the profile. It will say clay soil if it is adapted to clay soil. Desert willow does pretty well in clay soil, but look at that profile. And then also on the search, function where I showed you can check the different boxes, there's a box for clay soil. And so if you check that box, only the search results that come will be ones that normally do pretty well in clay soil. Additionally, some people have clay that drains really slow. Some people have pretty well draining clay soil, even in Chino Hills. We've done some designs for people who we have them do an infiltration test. And even though they have clay, it drains pretty well. And so definitely you want to check your drainage, because you can have a little more flexibility if you do have well-drained clay. And for the full kind of step-by-step how to do that drainage test and understand the results, check out that selecting, I'm going to get the exact name wrong, but it's on the YouTube page, and it's the selecting and planting Waterwise in California native plants. And we go through that whole drainage test. And then just one other question that came in, but just want to answer that about the Waterwise Community Center's demonstration garden. We have a park area which has some native plants that is always open just as a public park, but our main demonstration garden is open Monday through Saturday, closed Sundays from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. And then except for major holidays. So like the New Year's and Christmas fall on Saturdays. So it will be closed because our staff is not working on those days. Okay, desert willow question. Is it possible to trim it as a hedge? They take any trimming that you want, but because they go deciduous, Personally, I mostly prefer evergreen plants for hedges, and we're going to talk about some great ones. Okay, so next on the top trees list is Desert Museum Palo Verde. This is a hybrid. This is another true desert plant that grows really well around here. And it's a hybrid of different California native other Palo Verdes and multiple species. And this one gets the best characteristics out of all of them. It's a 20 to 25 foot tree again, prefers to be a multi-trunked or a low branch tree as well. Sometimes you see them trained to be a higher single trunk, but really, this or even a lower multi-trunk will look the best in your space. And it gets, because of the things it was selected for as the natural hybrid, very long blooming season in the spring to summer. Sometimes there's an extra pop of blooms in the fall. No thorns. Some of the Palo Verde species do have thorns. This has no thorns, and a beautiful green bark that you can't quite see in this picture. They don't have the strongest wood. So if you're in most areas they do fine, but if you're really in like a high wind blast zone, for example, we have some of our infiltration basin properties that are super tough, hardly get any water, look really good, but they just get blasted by the Santa Ana winds. So, they had some branch breaking after the last wind event. So something to think about, but great courtyard or patio tree. They do drop a lot of flowers in the flower season. So if you're someone who feels like they would need to be all swept up, maybe not the tree for you, but I really actually think it's quite beautiful. And the flowers just kind of dry out and eventually can be swept up, but it's almost like this yellow, bright yellow snow. It's absolutely gorgeous. Takes full blasting sun. Another one that's good next to, but not necessarily down at the bottom of dry stream beds. And they're also loved by pollinators and hummingbirds. And then this is one, I pretty much think that there is room for a toyon in any garden with the space, and they take pruning if you need to keep them a little smaller. This is one of the largest ones I have ever seen. Most of them are not going to get that big and wide. Toyon is a true local native plant. You find it up in our foothills all the time and local lower elevations of the mountains. And it really is extremely tough. It's also a plant that if you tune yourself into the red berries, which are on it like right now, Caltrans has used for many, many years actually, and they do well on those compacted, really just terrible soil freeway embankments. I mean, they can pretty much grow anywhere, full blasting sun to almost complete shade. They can take no water once they're established, but they can also take some, not necessarily weekly, but every other week watering, or if they're just kind of where their roots might be a little close to a lawn, they're not getting the lawn water, but the lawn's 10 feet away, they can handle that. it really wants to be a large shrub, but it can be pruned up to be more like a tree. And if you start earlier, you can get a much nicer form than this one. They are loved by butterflies and pollinators for these big clusters of white flowers that come in the spring. Those turn into these big clusters of red berries, but it's not a mess. The berries are kind of dry. There's mostly a seed inside. So it's one that I wouldn't hesitate to plant near pavement. It's not like a big moist berry, and they're ripening, like just like right now, kind of on that fall winter edge. And so they're really great for songbirds because there's not a lot of other kind of berries around right now. And so they're a great food source, and they're really beautiful. I mean, this is one of those, I say, native plants for people who think they don't like the look of native plants. It has that leathery leaf adaptation. So this thick leathery leaf is one that doesn't ever look dormant or really dried out. It looks kind of this nice even green kind of year round. You can see the buds of the flower cluster here, early spring, turn into these big clusters of small flowers, followed up by these beautiful red berries. And then for those of you who are really into wanting to support habitat, especially for song, this is an incredible one. This is an incredible one. Sorry, I just had some little audio stuff going on in the background. Please let me know if there's any problems with the audio. Normally that doesn't happen. It looks like everything is going pretty well on my side though. Okay, so getting back to it. Blue elderberry or Mexican elderberry, although it grows native in Mexico, but it also grows locally native around here. See it in wild areas, in all sorts of places. It often grows and really thrives in wild areas that accumulate just a little bit more water. So not like down in a waterway, but kind of in little grooves or notches, canyon areas. But then you also see it growing wild in really dry areas as well. It can kind of take the whole range. It can be right next to a lawn. It's not going to get too much water really usually, but it's kind of a wild and woolly thing. Depending on the individual planting conditions, it can go what's called summer dormant, and often does, meaning it's part of its adaptation is it loses its leaves in the summer. And then like right now, they're all leafing back out, depending on the individual conditions and individual plant. Our ones here at the Waterwise Community Center are just starting to leaf out. I have one at my house, which is well leafed out already. And then the form, it's kind of grows all over the place. You can prune it however much you want. As you can see, they made it work here. They must do a lot of pruning on it. So it's not for everybody, but I love it. I'm super happy to have it at home because a number of things. It grows really quickly. So in a new garden, it kind of helps establish some presence quite quickly. It gets huge clusters of flowers, mostly in the spring. It's another one with little white flowers. However, it can mostly in the spring, but then sporadically throughout most of the season up until it goes dormant. And so it can have actual, like you can see here, flowers and immature berries and then berries at the exact same time. And butterflies, as well as a variety of pollinating insects, really love the flowers, and birds absolutely adore the fruit. So it's really great habitat plant and is quite lovely in its own very wild way. So those are kind of my top small trees. Not the only small trees that you might consider planting, but that covers the small trees that are really kind of my go-tos. In shrubs, I'll also talk about another local native plant called Western Redbud, which sometimes I'll prune up as a small tree as well. But that's really kind of my go-to selections. So if you have any questions about these plants, keep coming in and I will answer them as we're talking about individual plants. If you have room to plant a large tree, by all means, plant a large tree. The shade that's cast in kind of the cool microclimate underneath a large tree is something else entirely. The shade underneath an oak tree is such a comfortable place to be, even on a really amazingly hot day. in inland Southern California, where like the shade that's cast by some of these smaller trees, it's nice, it helps, but it's not something where I necessarily am gonna like want to be outside. Where underneath an oak tree, you can sit in a chair or on a bench, and it's almost like its own air conditioning system. So if you have room for a large tree, plant one. If you have room for a single large tree in your yard, for most people, I would say consider planting a coast live oak, or if you're from a little bit farther away than our local area, whichever evergreen oak is native to your local area. We have a number of different oaks native to our local area, but for various reasons, coast live oak, if you only have room for one, is what's going to be the best for most people. It's going to be, in most garden situations, 35 to 40 feet wide over time. Very old ones, like you're never going to really probably experience it in your lifetime, can get quite a bit wider, but 35 to 40 feet wide over a number of decades is normal. They can be planted in full blasting sun. And oaks are so important to so much wildlife, from tiny little insects you'll never notice to so many different species of butterflies and moths. And people don't necessarily think of moths as a good thing, but these are moths that most of us will never notice. But the important thing about all of those little moth larvae on the oak leaves, which again, we are hardly ever going to notice. It's not like they're going to defoliate the plants, but with all those species come all sorts of caterpillars. Caterpillars are the number one most important food source for most species of baby birds. And so without plants that support having caterpillars on them, we don't get most species of baby birds. And then also oak trees are great nesting places for birds. And so it's kind of like the kind of food and structural habitat for many, many species of birds. In my yard, my backyard, I have room for one large tree. It's a young coast live oak, and we have so much more bird activity in our backyard garden because the oak tree is where a lot of them will live different times of years and then also constantly go back to. So birds naturally, they get startled and then they come back out. They get startled and they come back out. And our oak tree is where they fly into, where they get startled. So they don't leave our yard, they go in there and they hang out. I mean, it's often that I'll count like 6 different species of birds at one time in our one oak tree in the backyard. Some birds will also love to eat the acorns. If you're lucky, you might get an acorn woodpecker in your area. Occasionally we get them coming through. Scrub jays also really like the acorns as well. So kind of some of the medium-sized birds. And there's nothing like being in the shade of an oak on a warm day. If you have room, plant an oak. This is kind of not super young, but one that's on its way. This is one that's probably, I would guess, 60 years old, 80 years old. So you need some space, but totally worth it if you have the room. Other species of oaks are really lovely plants as well. So another one that people might think about in our local area is Engel Minoak, which I love. If you have room and you really like that, definitely plant it. Over time, it gets wide, but it kind of takes longer to get growing and stays quite narrow for a long time as it gets growing. It doesn't cast shade as young. So it's really going to be kind of multiple decades before you'll get shade, in my experience, from an Engel Minoak, where the coast live oak is kind of a rounder form. So you can get your shade a little bit earlier. But if you have room, Engelmann's a great one as well. A question came in. So Douglas Talame, who is an awesome writer, who talks a lot about backyard habitat, said that oaks can be cut to the ground and kept as a shrub. Have I seen this done to coast live oak? I've not seen it done intentionally, but I have seen it done through like it trying to be removed and not have the roots dug out, or bad maintenance practices. And it does spring right back up. So if that's your goal, you can probably do that. But there are also really great local native shrub oaks that you can plant. So one, I think it might just be called shrub oak, but the scientific name is Quercus burburida folia. But if you go to any Specialist native plant nursery. Can't always find the shrub oaks, but sometimes they have them. I just bought one recently for our garden and asked them if they have, the shrub oaks that would be good to plant in our local area. You can find those, and those will grow into a nice large shrub. We have a really nice one kind of near the street in the park part of our demonstration facility. And so I would probably just start with that and then not have to worry with cutting it down to the ground every year, especially because if there's birds nesting in it, you're not going to want to cut it back at the time. So consider the shrub oaks. Okay, let's keep going. However, if you want something that's going to get kind of tall, but you don't want that huge width, Catalina Cherry is a great way to go. And so did we talk about that? Yeah, we did talk about that already. So I think I have it here as well because it can get tall. So it's not that wide, but it can be tall. So it's great for screening. And I'm sorry, for some reason I thought, no, we didn't talk about cherry already. It's kind of in that transition because sorry about that. It's tall. It'll get 25 feet tall, maybe even taller, but it's not that wide, 10 to 15 feet wide instead of like 30 to 40 feet wide. And it can be pruned to stay smaller. It takes any sort of pruning. So we have some that get very little irrigation on kind of the backside of our property as a screen from some local houses that are next to our infiltration facility. And they're planted about 7 feet apart, and they form a really nice hedge that's about 20 feet tall and gets watered less than once a month. I had an area, specific part of my yard that I wanted to screen and planted them maybe about 2 years ago, about 7 feet apart. And they're not wide enough to provide the screening yet, but they're pushing over 10 feet tall now. They grow pretty quickly. They're great in a wet to dry transition zone. Again, great as a big hedge. They have another one with spring flowers and that are loved by pollinators. And then birds really love the fruit that follows. And they're also a larval host plant for many beautiful butterflies. So the caterpillars eat the leaves, but again, you're never going to really notice the damage to the leaves. But lovely ones to have around. And the fruit, it's a cherry, but it's not a really like wet fruit because it's mostly seed. It's a native cherry. Once they're fully ripe, you can eat them if you want to, but they don't taste that good. But the birds absolutely love them, medium-sized ones, mockingbirds, scrub jays, things like that. And because they're not wet, they don't make a mess. They don't like attract fruit flies, but I probably wouldn't use it directly over pavement because those pits would maybe be a trip hazard. Here is one of I consider it a large tree over time because I've seen some really big ones. This is not a native plant. This is native to the Mediterranean region, but is kind of a distant cousin of Manzanitas, one of our native species. You can consider it has a lot of the same visual aspects of it. And in terms of habitat, has some of the same features of Manzanita, mostly that it blooms in the winter and provides great nectar for pollinators and especially hummingbirds when there's not as much in bloom. It can get big over time. And so mostly around here, because it hasn't been around in the horticultural trade for that long, you see it as a medium-sized tree. But I have seen an old one in Santa Barbara area that was like 30 plus feet tall and wide. So it's beautiful here. I probably wouldn't put it that close to the corner of my house. It grows relatively slow compared to some of the other trees, but it will get going. Don't plant it if you need a tree in a hurry, though. It has beautiful winter flowers and lovely, lovely red bark. You can find it as a single trunk or a multi-trunk tree, and it will grow pretty well as either, but the multi-trunk trees are really, really the more beautiful ones. They do get a fruit that is quite attractive. It's about the diameter of a quarter, maybe. This kind of orangish reddish sphere, but it is a wet fruit on the inside. So You might not want to plant it over paved areas. We do have some that are over paved areas in our demonstration garden. There's not so much fruit that it's a huge nuisance. It just depends on the amount of work you want to do to keep your pathways clean. They are technically edible, but they don't taste like much. So, not something that would be more of like a garnish or a curiosity. And those are our top large trees. And now we're going to kind of start moving down to smaller and kind of smaller things that you might be interested in. Our next category are large shrubs, and large shrubs are often going to be used in a garden either as a group to provide like a visual barrier. You want a barrier in between different properties, kind of in the background. Some of them are going to do all right as hedges, which we talk about individually later, or as accents. So the large plant in the yard surrounded by more medium and smaller plants. And sometimes they're both. The accent can also be the thing that blocks the view of your neighbor's window into your backyard kind of thing. And so looking at large shrubs and accents, we already talked about toyon, but toyon, one of my favorites. So if you don't prune it up as a tall tree, you can leave it as a shrub, which is more of its natural form. And then oftentimes in a yard, you can do a little bit of pruning just to shape it. So like in this space, eventually it would be a little too wide for the space without any pruning, but it can just be clipped back to keep it as wide as it wants to be. I want to give a quick credit. Some of the pictures that you see here that are not from the Inland Valley Garden Planner website are credited to the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour. Theodore Payne Foundation is a nonprofit that is based out of the San Fernando Valley and Sun Valley area, but they are active in many parts of Southern California, especially around the Los Angeles area. And they are dedicated to promoting and conserving native plants. And a lot of what they do is through kind of horticulture. They have an awesome nursery that they propagate a lot of their own material, as well as sell stuff from other wholesalers that is open year round. A really great selection, very knowledgeable staff that's very helpful in some of this. I have a space that needs something that's adapted to this. It's sunny, it's shady, or whatever. Their staff can usually provide really good recommendations. They also do a lot of education classes and all sorts of other good programs, including an amazing 2-day garden tour of native gardens around Southern California that you can actually go and visit every spring. And so definitely check out Theodore Payne Foundation. And they very graciously allow me to use some of their pictures in my presentations that are promoting the use of native plants. So that's Theodore Payne Foundation. So this is a picture from one of the houses on one of their garden tours. So that's toyon. Okay, so here is Western Redbud. So this you can see really wants to grow as a shrub, but like I talked about as from toyon, it's actually pretty easy to prune up some of the lower branches and grow it as a multi-trunk tree. This is another one that sometimes in the nurseries, you will find it trained as an option for a single trunk tree. I don't recommend that for many reasons. It really wants to be a multi-trunk. If I only have room for a single trunk, personally, I won't plant it. They tend to lean over time. And over time, they stay more vigorous as a multi-trunk tree. And I believe that when I wrote out the maintenance section for the Inland Valley Garden Planner, I kind of explained why. We don't really need to get into that here, but recommend the multi-trunk. It is deciduous, so it loses all of its leaves and then starts normally with this great flowering in the early spring, and then the leaves come afterwards. And the leaves are quite beautiful as well. They're kind of these thin heart-shaped leaves. Pollinators love the spring blooms, especially some of the native pollinators, the native big bumblebees. And native pollinators, they don't sting like honeybees. They're normally solitary. Some of them have small colonies, but honeybees sting because they're protecting this large colony and this store of honey normally, whereas our native pollinators, they don't have like that big thing to protect, and so they're not aggressive. So they're just nice to have around, and they provide great pollination services and great services to the ecosystem. And so you will see lots of especially big bumblebees on these, which is pretty cool. And so they go from this in the spring You can see here, they start to have these heart-shaped leaves come out, which up close have these bronze and almost pinkish edges to them when it has the new growth. And then the flowers turn into these pods, which are quite ornamental as well. And those pods then dry seeds in them, and those become bird feeders. So there's a lot going on. It's one that towards the end of the season, kind of late summer through the fall, the leaves start to yellow up some. They tend to look a little bit crispy. So originally, when I started gardening, I didn't really love the look of it in the fall, to be honest. And I tended to mostly plant it in places that get some afternoon shade, which kind of prevents it from looking as dried out in the fall. But now I actually love the look, and I have it right front and center in the corner of my driveway because I'm more tuned into the seasons as a gardener now. And I've realized that even that turning yellow and kind of slowly drying out at the tips before it falls, that's part of the dynamic of things changing all the time. And there's a really lovely rugged beauty in it that now I kind of cherish as something ornamental in my garden. And so now we're moving from kind of the larger shrubs down to kind of the medium-sized shrubs that form more visual accents in the garden. One that's a true desert plant, so this can take all the heat you can throw at it, that I love as an ornamental is Apache Plume. That's one for full blasting sun. And the flower, and actually that is a typo. It's actually a beautiful feathery seed plume. The flower is a little white thing. And, oh, sorry, not a typo. Beautiful feathery flower parts, a seed plume that remains after the flowers fade. And so you use it for the kind of effect in the garden. So this pinkish feathery stuff going on right here, that's the Apache Plume. The plant itself is just kind of a shrubby thing with little leaves on it. But these flower parts stay on it for much of the year. And so it's ornamental for the vast majority of the year. Here's the close-up, just absolutely gorgeous. And if you plant it again somewhere where it captures really the morning or the afternoon light, these things just glow. I've never been able to take an adequate picture of how beautiful it is in person. Gorgeous, gorgeous plant with a very unique effect. Howard Mcminn Manzanita is kind of the opposite of that. This is another one of those native plants for people who don't necessarily think they like the native plant look. It different than Toyon, but like Toyon, has that thick, leathery, dark leaf that looks nice year round and has a gorgeous red bark. And so most of the species and cultivars of Toyon can be shrubs all the way to the ground. But once they get large enough, a lot of people will prune them up. So remove some of the lower, smaller branches to expose the structure and this beautiful red bark. There are many, many different kinds of manzanitas. Lots of really cool ones. We're going to talk about just a couple of them because they're honestly, for casual gardeners, some of them are not the easiest ones to grow. Some of them can be a little sensitive to really not wanting too much water, but then you have to water them enough. Whereas the ones that I recommend as kind of my go-tos, as part of my default plant palette, are the ones that are easiest for home gardeners, easiest for home garden conditions. If they get a little more water than they need, they're not going to kind of freak out, which is when you hear certain native plants are difficult to grow. That's definitely not all native plants, but certain ones really want low water, but they need enough water to get established. And if you water them too much, they're going to have problems. The native plants we're talking about are the ones that tend to be some of the easiest to grow and be successful with for home gardens. Howard Mcminn Manzanita, it's a specific Manzanita cultivar. That's one of the easiest to grow. It's a medium-sized shrub. This is a quite old one. This is one of the largest that I've seen. Often used as a hedge as well, although it does grow relatively slowly at the beginning. So not like you want to hedge in a year, but you're kind of willing to, invest in it over time. I tend to use the manzanitas more as a single accent plant where they're lovely smaller shrubs, but I put them in an area so when they do get big over time, they can be celebrated there. Great habitat plant, partially because they get winter flowers as well, a great nectar source for hummingbirds in the winter, and nectar source for butterflies as well. And they then go from those flowers to these little, again, seedy, pretty dry, so they don't make a mess, red berries that are loved by birds. And Howard Mcminn, different manzanitas have different sun and shade requirements. Howard Mcminn is great in full sun to part shade and really does the best in our hot inland areas. I feel like with a little bit of afternoon shade. So full sun and then, or dappled shade, but it can take full sun. And then, especially if it gets a little bit of shelter in the afternoon from a building or something like that, really is where it'll thrive. Building, backyard kind of wall, something like that. So they're great on like the east side of a house, east side of a garage, east side of a wall or a fence. Here you can see it being maintained more like a shrub. They can take pruning to whatever size and kind of stay compact. That's Howard Mcminn Manzanita. I can't remember if I talk about it later, to be honest, but Sunset Manzanita is another one of my go-tos. So if we don't cover that later, sorry, I don't remember, but definitely check out Sunset Manzanita as well. That's the one I chose for my front yard. Another true native desert plant, super, super great plant if you like color almost year round. Number one, probably hummingbird attracting plants for local gardens is Baja fairy duster, considered a California native because it grows in what's called technically the California floristic province, but it's from Baja, California. And it is it's a kind of, this is one of the more full ones that I've seen. Normally it's a kind of what's called leggy shrub. So it's kind of stemmy with these little, they're thick, but kind of like ferny shaped leaves, but is covered with these kind of starburst red flowers almost year round in inland Southern California. The vast majority of native plants, we recommend that people plant in the fall to early winter. The California native desert plants mostly do well in that time period, but also can be planted in the spring. In my experience, this is one of the exceptions where if you plant it in the fall, or especially in the winter, normally kind of sulks in the colder weather. And if it's an area that gets a frost, sometimes they'll kind of die back at the beginning. This one has tended to do better for me actually planted in the spring, kind of one of the exceptions. And then it kind of tends to start growing. Sometimes I plant these and they just take off right away. Sometimes they grow pretty slowly the first year and then get going, and then they take off. Really cool plant to have for a lot of color in the garden. And then this one, it's kind of the opposite than the lot of color in the garden. This is just kind of common green a lot of the year, but then gets these beautiful, lovely, very small white flowers, almost like a cottony, cloudy effect over a lot of it in this time of year, kind of in the fall through early winter. But this is fast growing. So where you need a fast growing green shrub, has small flowers. They're almost hard to see, but they're loved by beneficial insects and pollinators. And then the fluff that comes after kind of the flowering is really the beautiful part, especially if it's somewhere that captures a little bit of afternoon sun. Absolutely gorgeous. Birds will eat the seed, and it's a pretty dense kind of branchy shrub on the inside. And so it's really good cover for birds, and birds really like to nest in them as well. So it's a great choice for kind of habitat focused plants. Not the most attractive thing up close. I mean, it's green, but it's really where it thrives is kind of as a background plant for a nice, quick growing green backdrop that then has that beautiful kind of fluffy white flower stuff going on part of the year, and then really makes other contrasting plants in front of it look great. In our habitat focused class, our gardening for birds, butterflies, pollinators, and more, we talk about this concept of a habitat hedge. We're choosing a diversity of native plants that are all kind of in that mid-sized shrub and planting them next to each other along a wall of a yard. And this is an awesome one to mix in for kind of its habitat benefits. Another one of my favorite for habitat hedges, but also really holds its own as a beautiful individual plant, is hollyleaf cherry. So this is the actual local native, smaller, you can say like cousin of that tall Catalina island cherry. They're pretty similar. They're actually the same species and just a separate, for those of you who are interested in this sort of stuff, separate subspecies, where the other one grows on the the Channel Islands, and this one is the real California mainland native. Smaller and more compact, elegant looking shrub year round. It has a glossy leaf that stays looking nice and green year round. You can see what the flowers do in the spring. Pollinators go nuts over these blooms. Birds love the fruit that follows it. It looks just like the fruit of the Catalina Island cherry, but is a little bit smaller and is an incredible larval host plant for many species of butterflies as well. So the habitat hedge in my front yard, where I wanted things at this edge with this neighbor's property to look pretty clean year round and really have a nice green backdrop for a much more seasonal up and down garden in front of it, where it's like lots of color in the spring and calmer in the summer. So that habitat hedge, which is also kind of the visual backdrop, is a combination of hollyleaf cherry and this next plant, which is California coffeeberry. This is one of my very favorite California native plants. This is another one, green, solid kind of foundational planting year round. There are the normal species, which will get 8 to 10 feet tall and 8 to 10 feet wide, but absolutely takes pruning any time of the year. Just clip it back to whatever size you want. So it's great for a property boundary hedge. So mine is creating a visual barrier between a gravel strip and driveway of my neighbor's house and then my yard. So it's very easy to just 2 or 3 times a year with just a hand pruner as I walk onto my neighbor's gravel strip and just do a little bit of touch-up pruning on the backside while I let it get taller. What are the things that I absolutely love about California coffeeberry? Other than that nice, clean, green backdrop look, it can grow in full sun to pretty much full shade. And so especially if you want like a backdrop that has additional native plant benefits that goes from sunnier to shadier to part shade areas, this is one that'll do really well through those transitions. For a larger plant that'll do that, Toyon works well as well. The ones in the shade will grow slower, but they will all grow and look pretty great together. Elegant looking year round. It gets these tiny spring, summer little flowers that are absolutely loved by pollinators. And then birds really love the fruit that follows, and we'll see pictures later on. It's called coffeeberry because the fruit starts green, then turns red, and then gets to be a kind of dark coffee color, not flavor. The birds can eat them and love them. Humans cannot eat them. They are mildly toxic, meaning they won't kill you, but they will give you a very upset stomach. So yeah, best to, I've never heard of a problem of people like planting them in their front yards because of that. I mean, there's lots of plants in the general landscape that people cannot eat. But, you know, if you have a little kid who is in the phase of putting everything in their mouth and you're worried that they would eat these, maybe skip that one until they're a little bit older. But other than that, you know, really does great. Host plant to a number of larval butterfly species as well. And there's great dwarf selections. In inland Southern California, the dwarf selection that does the best, in my experience, tends to be one called Eve Case. And that's one that'll get normally only about like hip high, and then it'll get 5 to 6 feet wide. Again, can take pruning to stay smaller. And like I have a dwarf, I have an Eve Case one in a pot in my backyard, a large pot, does very well in a pot as well, the dwarf one. And so here you can see the growth on it, and you can see it's green year round, but the older dark green and then the really fresh lighter green new growth is a lovely contrast as well. These are the flowers, you know, not showstopper that you see from across the garden, but quite lovely up close. And that's California coffeeberry, one of my very favorite native plants that I think should probably be in most home gardens, whether it's the full-size one or the dwarf one. Another large shrub is Golden Abundance Oregon Grape. That is a native hybrid Oregon grape selection. This is one in inland Southern California for part shade to full shade areas or northern exposure. So if you need a big shrub for up against the north side of the house or the garage, this is a good one. However, I will say that it takes pruning, but you can see here, like in my opinion, this is a little too close to the pathway. You can kind of see how wide it wants to get, and then how much trimming that they've had to do to kind of keep things so that it can be passable, and they'd have to do more trimming to keep it that way. And the leaves themselves are actually kind of spiny. They're not like true thorns, but they're kind of like holly, something like that, or even like an oak tree, where they have those kind of prickles on the edge of the leaves. So personally, I wouldn't want it this close to a walkway. However, to grow, if you have more space, like to grow underneath the window, sometimes people want some kind of prickly plants. That's something great. I tend to put it in space where there's some room for it to grow. The flowers erupt early in the spring, so it's kind of a great like come and get it, everybody, for pollinators as well as butterflies. And then these beautiful flowers will then develop into these tiny blue berries that are seedy, and if they don't get eaten, they tend to just kind of dry up, so they don't make a big mess. Birds love them. They are edible for people, but they're just really seedy and tart. So I honestly don't know why most people would bother. But yeah, great habitat plant. They have very glossy, attractive leaves. And if they are planted in that proper situation of that part shade, dappled shade, northern exposure, look really clean year round, and just have lots of color going on between the flowers and then the berries, and can sometimes even in the cold kind of flush a little bit of a different color in the leaf. And so those are our larger kind of shrubs, kind of top choices. There's lots of other great ones, but these are some of my favorites. Great question from Anne. California coffeeberry, are they toxic to dogs? I've tried to look that up and haven't been able to get clear information. I would say the ASPCA has a pretty good, it's the best database I know about plants that are toxic to dogs and cats. And I believe, and if you're thinking about planting it and have dogs, definitely look it up, because I can't remember exactly. I believe that I looked it up and didn't see it on that list, but that doesn't mean that they have all of the plants there. So I would kind of take the stance where, since it is non-fatal but not good for humans to eat, there's a decent chance that that's the case for dogs, although I fully realize that things are different. I would assume that it is at least very unpleasant for all mammals to eat it. Like, I've never seen squirrels eating coffee berries. But if you have a dog that kind of tends to chew on all sorts of stuff, I would definitely skip it. If you're seriously thinking about it, you might call the nursery at the Theodore Payne Foundation, and they might know. That's something that, yeah, I've tried to look into and haven't been able to get a clear answer yet. So I'd say out of an abundance of caution, if you're worried about it, maybe skip it. But I'd encourage you to do a little bit of extra research on that. Great question. And so I think what we will do is, it is 10:30. We are halfway through the workshop time, and there's going to be a lot of shrubs in this middle layer. So we've talked about the trees, the larger shrubs that are kind of going to be more as usually as a background plant. And now we're going to talk about all of the great Waterwise and native plants for the medium and small size shrubs. This is going to be like most of the plant selections for a lot of our yards, as in front of our backgrounds, we're building layers and visual depth. And so there's going to be a lot of different plant selections and information. So why don't we take our 5-minute break, take a breath, and then we will get going again. So it's basically 10:33. We'll start back up again at 10:38. If you have questions, type them in, and we will get going again. Talk to you in just a few minutes. Okay, let's get going again. Had just one question come in, which was about the Desert Museum Palo Verde tree, and does it have an invasive root system? Because there is one at the California Botanic Garden in an area, and the paving around it is lifted up. I will say that that area, while lovely, that tree is really close, surrounded by paving. So they're not known to have a particularly invasive root system. They do, like all trees, to prevent them if they're near pavement, want deep infrequent watering, and maybe it's in an area where it's not getting much water at all, so maybe that's part of it, but it's also really, really close. So for all trees, as beautiful as it looks to have a tree like right close surrounded by paving, I would never actually recommend that, especially if you want the tree to be healthy and the pavement to be long-lived. I'd always, even a small tree, planted a number of feet off the edge of a paved area. Or if you really want to have a patio space right around it, work with something soft like decomposed granite or gravel around it for the patio instead of pavers or like concrete or something like that. Okay, let's jump back into it with this middle layer. So many amazing plants for the middle layer to mix and match. Here are just some of my favorites that happen to be laid out at this garden that I visited as part of the Theodore Payne Foundation garden tour. And we'll talk about all these, the Cleveland sage hybrids, beautiful white sage, the dwarf pigeon point coyote brush, the tall perennial, these beautiful flowers, showy penstemon. So here we're talking about layers, and that is one of, we talk in the design class much more about it, but kind of thinking about, this is one of the things that planting designers think about. Here's some pictures from my front yard. Here is my toyon that I'm starting to grow as a multi-trunk tree. It's still more of a shrub right now, growing, but I planted it from a tiny 1 gallon plant, and it is 8 feet tall and probably 6 feet wide now after 2.5 years. So it's well on its way. And then with that, we kind of have a middle layer where you can see some of the taller ornamental grasses, and then also the kind of a small part of the middle layer, kind of knee-high verbena, and then some smaller ground covers in the front. Here's another picture where you can see some of the layering. In the back, you can see just starting to grow in. So it'll be like almost twice as tall, the habitat hedge, which will be the dark layer in the back of the coffee berry and cherry that's going to kind of form a wall. And in front of it, we have a native sage, a native deer grass. Off to the side framing it, we have what we'll talk about later, fragrant pitcher sage. And then the very low kind of walking area of yarrow around the bird bath and some other small perennials. And then later on in the same year, we have the sage now in bloom, so much taller with the flowers. And then the yarrow and some of the other plants, the coyote mints, are in bloom now when the spring bloomers faded. And so this is a big one, if you have room for it. One of my very favorite Waterwise plants. There are a number of different native sages, which are all almost, in terms of the purposes for the home gardener, the same plant. They are Allen Chickering sage, Pozo blue sage, or Worley blue sage. If you see any of those, you can they're going to have the exact same characteristics. I personally, I've been working with all of these plants for many years, and I can't tell them apart in the garden. They're basically a hybrid of 2 California native sage species that naturally can occur. And so they're all the same 2 parent species and just literally different selections, which are then propagated by cuttings, but very similar plants. They are full sun plants, happy in full blasting sun. They smell absolutely amazing. I love teaching online workshops, but the smells of the native plants are one of the things that just can't quite can't share, but they smell absolutely amazing. Come pull off a leaf and break it and smell it, or just brush your hand through it to our demonstration garden at the Waterwise Community Center if you're nearby, and give it a smell. The flowers, which last for quite a while, spring to early summer, are absolutely adored by pollinators and hummingbirds. And then once those flowers dry out, if you leave them on for a while to dry out and let the seeds ripen, lots and lots of small songbirds, especially the finches, will come and eat the seeds out of them after that. In the inland heat, in our inland gardens, this thing gets big. You will commonly read on plant labels and plant databases that you can expect any of these sages to get like 4 to 6 feet wide. In inland Southern California, you can keep it trimmed with annual pruning to maybe about 6 feet at the minimum. And generally, without pruning, like we have some in our demonstration garden, very gravelly soil that doesn't get a whole lot of water, and they're 10 feet wide. And they're gorgeous. They're beautiful. But oftentimes I see these in residential landscapes just planted way too close to walkways, way too close to the sidewalk, and eventually they need to get taken out. And in fact, I planted one just because it was what was available and I wanted to fill some space 2 years ago or so, maybe about 2 years ago in my backyard garden. And it has gotten 10 feet wide, and I'm taking it out tomorrow to put in a smaller plant. And it was great for a couple of years, grew in really fast when some of the smaller stuff hadn't grown in yet. But yes, I'm still did the same thing, and I loved it, but it's time to put in something smaller in that particular space. The one in my front yard, I do prune it annually to keep it 6 to 8 feet wide, and it does fine. But if I didn't prune it, it would need more space than that. And here's the flower clusters, just so extremely beautiful. Another one of my favorite native sages that has a little bit of a different look is white sage. This is locally native to the area that we are, and is a pretty well-known plant, great for the home garden, thrives in full blasting sun, smells absolutely amazing. Hummingbirds and pollinators really, really love this thing, especially bumblebees as well love sages, and especially I feel like I see them on the white sage. And same thing with the other sage, the small songbirds use the seeds after that. At least in my yard, for the goldfinches, this is like some of their favorite seeds. They will, once these seeds develop and dry out, they will spend hours picking out every single one of these seeds that they can. And then some of the other native birds come around for the ones that fall onto the ground underneath it. Absolutely lovely plant. The flowers can get kind of long, and when they dry out, kind of stringy. I don't mind that look at all. I have it in a pretty front and center place in my home garden, but it's also absolutely excellent a little bit farther back into the midground. Like, for example, we'll talk about deer grass later. Mixing this kind of with the tall flowers coming out amongst deer grass is just like, that's a 2-plant combination that could be most of a front yard and just be incredibly just drop dead gorgeous. Has a really lovely, very almost white leaf up close. And here's what happens when you put it somewhere that catches the light. It's just absolutely gorgeous. And just a reminder from all of these pictures that come from the Inland Valley Garden Planner, for those of you who join later, detailed profiles on all of this at the Inland Valley Garden Planner. In some ways, this workshop is just a big promo for the Inland Valley Garden Planner with some of my specific recommendations. Also really lovely matched with California buckwheat, which is another one that gets way bigger in local gardens than you will often read about, another 8-foot wide kind of deal in local gardens around here, but that darker with the kind of taller and wider, it's beautiful. So here is California buckwheat. This is a true local native plant, and one that just will like cover whole local hillsides. Fine in full blasting sun, can actually take, it's considered a full sun plant, but it can actually take a decent amount of part shade if it needs to. Definitely more floriferous, more flowers in full sun. Long bloom season, blooms most of the year, I feel like, in full sun. And this is one that I have west facing,
near my asphalt driveway. Hardly give it any water at all. Does great, blooms most of the year. Really important plant for pollinators and butterflies. Birds will eat the seed. Larval host plant for many butterflies. Super, super easy plant to grow. Just make sure you have the room for it. There are some kind of lower ground covers that stay only about knee high and don't spread quite as wide, quite as fast. And then the normal species will be, it depends based on the nursery you get it from and their seed stock, but somewhere between somewhere like mid-thigh to maybe hip high kind of normally being the tallest. If you plant too many of them too close together, they will get taller because they'll kind of grow over each other, but really give this one space, minimum 5 feet, better to give it 6 to 8 feet of space in the garden. And there's some smaller cousins of this one that are less large that we will talk about. For all of the native buckwheats, including this one of the most beautiful things about them is that as the blooms fade, they kind of turn this rust color. So some people have grown up thinking when the blooms fade, you have to cut them off. Don't do that for buckwheats. It will be a lot of work. And part of the beauty is the contrast between the faded rusty blooms and then the fresh ones. And I just leave them on. If you want to, you can give them a little bit of a cleanup once a year. I just always leave them on, and the old ones eventually kind of start to break apart a little bit and just kind of go away usually. And the new ones keep coming. For the home garden, one of my very favorite plants is the sort of Santa Cruz, so kind of Channel Islands cousin from Santa Cruz Island. That's why it's called Santa Cruz Island buckwheat. Channel Islands cousin of our native buckwheat, and that's called Santa Cruz Island buckwheat. It's a little bit smaller. Another one that does tend to get a little bit larger than you often see listed in the databases in our area, about 5 feet wide to maybe 6 feet wide over time. It doesn't grow quite as quickly as our local native buckwheat, so it's a little bit easier. You can keep it pruned to 5 feet wide pretty easily, maybe about hip high, and it has this kind of a lighter, little bit fuller foliage. They're not lacy, but when you look at the plant as a whole, it almost gets a kind of like a, lacy kind of texture. Not quite sure what the right word is, but it's absolutely lovely. And the flower clusters are these big, wide flower clusters, which also kind of start to fade over time. And you get this really nice contrast of the buds are almost silvery, and then the whitish flowers, and then the faded rusty colored flower clusters are just so lovely in the garden. We have this in full blasting reflected heat from the parking lot afternoon sun at the Waterwise Community Center, and it thrives even though it's a plant from the Channel Islands. Blooms for much of the year. Super important for pollinators and beneficial insects. We actually used to have this right across from the sidewalk from the local California native buckwheat, the one we just looked at. Since had to remove it because it was too big for the space. But one day, kind of on a hot midsummer day when I thought lots of pollinators and beneficial insects would be out, I couldn't find any on our local native buckwheat. And I was wondering why. And then I looked across the path and they were all on this one. They like it so much. So great habitat plant. Birds like the seed, larval host plant for many butterflies, really easy to grow. It tends to sell out of the nurseries pretty quickly. So you might not always be able to find it when you're looking for it, but if you see it, buy it. A question, are buckwheats long-lived? The shrub buckwheats do tend to be pretty long-lived. We'll talk about red buckwheat a little bit later, which is a small kind of perennial buckwheat. That one, not as much, but the large buckwheats do tend to be quite long-lived. From Margaret was asking about a 3 to 5 foot wide plant that takes blasting heat and roof drainage from the rain. Things don't tend to live more than a couple of years. Margaret, if you can text back into the Q&A what your soil type is. Do you have well draining soil? Do you have heavy clay soil? That I can make a recommendation from something of these mid-sized plants that we're talking about. Okay, next one. This is actually kind of like a big flowering perennial plant, but it's so tall that I put it in this kind of like mid-ground kind of list. because it's too tall. And then eventually when the flowers start leaning a little bit, I don't use it like in the very foreground or along a pathway, like where the smaller perennial flowering plants would be. This is the showy penstemon. So I showed that. It was on the right of that first picture I showed where I was talking about lots of different plants. And it's kind of just a small green leafy plant that's only like shin high most of the year. And then in the spring, it sends up these columns of these gorgeous iridescent purple blue flowers that hummingbirds love, native pollinators love. And they could be on a happy established plant, almost like head high. When you see them in the wild, they're maybe about hip high, but with that little bit of water, from most of our native gardens, they tend to be a bit larger. And so I will mix it with the shrubs or with something like the bunch grasses. And so when it's small and it's just in its green phase, there's not much to look at. So it kind of goes away. And then you get these huge blooms in the spring. Absolutely lovely. And just one of my favorite plants. A front yard of deer grass, white sage, and this, call it a day, could just be absolutely gorgeous. Also a good butterfly larval host plant as well. And so you can see here, this is part of my front yard. You can see our redbud growing into the back, but have this coming up in between some mounds of the native deer grass. And that's what it does. It just kind of goes away when it's not in bloom. And then there's this gorgeous show every spring. Okay, Margaret got back to me before we move on to the next plant with her soil. Gravelly soil north of Paris. So kind of almost in the desert area. Full blasting sun. So I would figure in that spot, you're going to probably be wanting to think about some of the true desert, like grow at the edge of riparian area plants, which happens. This would be one that I would consider. Would be desert mallow. This tends to be a big kind of floppy plant, not that tall, maybe about hip tall at the most, but does tend to, another one in the inland heat, get a little bit wider than the catalogs say. You often see it listed as a 4-foot wide plant. And with a lot of pruning, like here, you can tell it was next to a sidewalk. This must get clipped back a couple of times a year, which is viable thing to do if you want. And it will just grow right back out in the warm season after it gets clipped back and rebloom usually. But it tends to be kind of a more billowy, floppy thing. That's going to be a 5 to 6-ish feet wide in inland gardens. And to me, I like that. So I'll use it as kind of something that's looser near some plants that are kind of more of a tighter, true like shrub plant. And it just has these big clusters of these bright orange, gorgeous flowers. Loves full blasting sun, very low water plant, but because it's a true desert plant, a lot of our true desert plants can take a little bit of summer water because they get summer thunder showers. So north of Paris might be a good one. And you see them growing in kind of perched up above washes in desert areas. So could be a good choice. Good choice for full blasting sun, reflected heat, parking lot type driveway edge areas. Just what you'll get is, if you really want to keep it good looking, maybe an extra time in the middle of summer, once the flower clusters have kind of like dried out mostly, give it a cut back and it'll stimulate some growth and you might get to flower again. Personally, I only prune it in my yard about once a year, but in like botanical garden landscapes that I've done, we would cut it back a little bit more often. Flowers are loved by pollinators and butterflies, and another great larval host plant for native butterflies. You can see these lovely, lovely flowers close up. Another kind of a distant cousin of this one, they're both what are called mallow family. And so you can see they have a slightly fuzzy leaf, same kind of leaf shape, a very, very distant cousin of like the tropical hibiscus. So if you see any kind of similarities, that's why. This one has a slightly fuzzy leaf. This one has a very fuzzy, soft leaf and enough fuzz that it kind of almost gets that glow in the morning and afternoon light. This is bigger. This is going to be 5 to 6 feet wide, a little bit more than hip height. Another one that's okay with full blasting sun. is very low water use, but I think that they do need, in my experience, to do well, a little bit of extra water in the summer compared to some of the other true desert plants. Flowers are loved by pollinators and butterflies. Larval host plant to some butterflies, not quite as many as the previous one we looked at, the desert mallow, compared to the Palmer's mallow. But the Palmer's mallow is maybe more of a showy ornamental plant as well. I like them both. I have them both in my yard. I think they're great. This one is definitely needs a little bit more of its own space. And yeah, the fuzzy leaves just seem to glow when the sun hits them just right. I haven't been able to get a great picture of it. This one shows even the flower clusters kind of glow. This doesn't even do it justice. And they kind of hold up high, and the flower clusters, the buds, and even the spent flowers are just amazing when they're backlit. So another great desert plant. And now we're going to kind of pull it in the opposite direction. These are in no particular order in here. So now we're going to go to likes more sheltered, can survive in full sun. I've seen it, but really thrive in either part shade or even significant shade, or the north side of buildings. So this is Creeping Oregon Grape is one of my favorites for if you want kind of like a classic low foundation plant to be along the base of a house, in that like 3 foot wide kind of planter that it's kind of hard to know what to do with, on the north side of a house is great for that. That's what I have in my kind of not very wide planter on the north side of my house. I have 3 of these in a row. They're great kind of spotted here and there, or you can do a whole long row of them. It's a smaller, you can think of cousin as that Golden Abundance Oregon grape that we talked about earlier. Likes a lot of the same conditions. Same thing with the early spring yellow flowers followed by a very similar fruit. This one just gets not much more than knee high and slowly will creep by rhizomes, but very easy to prune to size. It's not really invasive. It just needs a little bit of pruning over time. And this is one that when we get our colder parts of the winter, the foliage reliably turns this kind of blushed plum color. Absolutely gorgeous. And then that can continue through the spring. By midsummer, it's normally more of an even green again, and just has so much color going on. And now we're back to the desert. Desert through, actually native to our local area as well. It has a very long range. This is brittlebush, another one of my favorite native plants. This is it's a bush sunflower that has a white foliage, almost similar color to white sage, but it's a little bit bushier, kind of more even of a shrub. And in inland gardens, spring through most of the summer has just almost covered in these daisy kind of sunflowery flowers. Absolutely adored. And then it will kind of slow down, and is supposed to kind of slow down in the fall, winter. But even just like the last heat wave that we had, that was kind of the unseasonable fall heat wave, pushed them back into bloom. So like the one in my backyard, I was about to prune it back, and now it's in bloom all of a sudden again. So now I'm kind of deciding what to do with it. Can take that full blasting sun. Flowers loved by butterflies and pollinators. Birds will come around and eat the dried out seeds. And in large ones, the birds in my yard tend to also like to shelter in it during the day, and they'll fly out from it, go to the bird bath, eat some seeds, fly back into it. Just kind of has that right branching structure on the inside. So that is brittle bush. This is another one though. Inland tends to get bigger than you might read. So you'll often read like 4 or 5 feet. And with annual pruning, you can keep it to 5 feet, but without at least 6, if not an 8 foot wide shrub. Depends how much water it gets as well. So growing natively in our local area on no water at all, the seeds that come up will be oftentimes like knee high and 3 or 4 feet wide, but with a little bit of water or kind of loamier soil in our gardens, they tend to be quite a bit larger. Those are some of my very favorites, but there's others that I'm going to cover here, which are pretty solid ones to consider. Black sage is another local native sage, which has a
true dark green leaf, so darker green than most of the almost white leaves of the other native sages, and gets those long clusters that you can see here of white flowers. Black sage, if you have a really gravelly, excessively drained almost soil, which some people locally do, tends to need a bit more water than some of the other sages. If you have kind of like a loamy or more heavy soil, doesn't really need more water. So it's something to consider. And black sage, if it's happy, gets quite wide. Another one that will grow longer than what you see, especially I've used it a number of times where it just happens to be like not directly irrigated, but at the edge of an irrigated area. So I have one in my backyard now, for example, that was planted probably 5 or 6 feet away from the area that gets the sprinklers from my fruit trees. And once it got its roots kind of into that area, I don't give it any water at all, but it just thrives just from that water. It's able to stretch and reach. And it's like 10 feet wide now. It's huge, a little bit too tall. I need to give it a pretty hard cut back every year, but it's just so happy and so floriferous. Will stay a little bit smaller with less water, but still inland, consider it to be probably like a 6 foot wide at least. And it tends to have a little bit of a different flowering season than the other sages, which is nice to keep flowers going year round. It tends to bloom a little bit earlier than the sages and a little bit later, meaning like in gardens around here, sometimes it'll start blooming in the winter and then be like blooming into like early spring before the other sages have started, and has a lot of the other great habitat benefits. Has a little bit of a sweeter smell than the other sages. Smells absolutely amazing. Not a California native plant, but is one that is very popular around here, and for some pretty good reasons. Mexican sagebush, sometimes called Mexican sage, is another sage, and it's just not locally native. It is a low water plant. Picture it liking a little bit more water than our true native sages, but it can take a little bit more shade than our true native sages. Really does prefer full sun though. Will give you the most flowers in full sun, but it blooms throughout more of the year than most of our native sages. I mean, it's still from its spring blooms, it's still blooming in gardens now. And it is used by our native pollinators. So not all non-native plants are really loved by native pollinators, but I have had this in gardens where I also have like all the native sages I'm talking about in the garden. And when those sages are done blooming for the season, when I go up close and I check the flowers of these, those same pollinators have moved on to this thing. It can get huge. You see it's overgrowing the sidewalk here. It often overgrows the place that it's put into. This is another one that 8 to 10 feet wide inland easily. So make sure you give it some space, bigger than the labels will say. There is a dwarf selection that I am most fond of called Santa Barbara Mexican sagebush. That one is only going to be about knee tall. It'll still get 5 or 6 feet wide. It does, unlike our true native sages, need a hard cutback every year. So our true native sages, if you prune them annually, which a lot of people will do, they get just generally a medium to light cutback once a year. These things pretty much get cut to the ground every year and need to stay looking good. So throughout the season, and like right now, we still have a few blooms on the ones in our demonstration garden, but a lot of the lower leaves have died back and fallen. So it's what's called leggy at the bottom. You see a lot of stems. It's not the most attractive thing anymore, but it already has some fresh new growth at the base. And so every year you have to cut it all the way back. Some people are fine with that. Some people won't want to do that maintenance, but it is such a long bloomer that I do keep it on this list. Now moving to one of my very favorite grasses. I've mentioned it a couple of times already. This is deer grass, local native plant. In its native areas, it tends to grow in what are called riparian areas, so areas that accumulate a little bit of water or maybe flood when there is rain, but it is a low water plant. It's not one that'll look great with no water at all, but with the monthly irrigation that most of our native gardens will get, in the warmer months tends to thrive in most soils. If you have extremely gravelly or extremely rocky soil, probably not one for a low water garden. We have extremely gravelly soil in part of our park, and we're actually going to be removing some of the deer grass just because it never thrived. But in my more loamy soil, just a number of blocks away where I live, thrives on very low water use. But because of where it comes from and where it naturally grows, it can take plenty of water. So this is a great one for a wet to dry transition area, like you're transitioning from an irrigated lawn to a true low water. This can go in that whole transition zone and it will just thrive in that area. Or areas like right along a dry stream bed where seasonally it'll get very wet from the water draining through it, will thrive there. Here you can see it are the flowers. So a lot of ornamental grasses, they get these big, billowy, gorgeous flowers, but then as soon as they dry out, they start to fall apart. They start to look like they need to be cut back. Deer grass, the flowers are actually this thin. And so after they dry out, they just kind of stay even when they're dried out. And so you really only cut them back to refresh them normally every 2 or 3 years in an ornamental kind of garden. You can cut them back every year, but they just don't need that. They are absolutely loved by goldfinches. They'll come and they'll actually land on these and pick through all the seeds, and just even their little weight will make all the little fronds be bopping around. Really cool to see happening in your garden. They do in some ways get a little bit wider than you'll read about in catalogs. Or online, you'll normally read that these will get 3 to 4 feet wide. And the grass part itself will get about 4 feet wide. But you can see what's starting to happen here and will continue to happen through the season is that these beautiful, beautiful flower stems kind of lay out, and eventually they'll be laid out in every direction. And so from flower stem to flower stem, these things will reliably be about 6 feet wide. And so in the garden, mixed with other plants, you can give it 4 feet or 5 feet of space per bunch grass. And then the outer flower stalks will kind of be intermixing with the other shrubs and perennials, and that's lovely. But if it's along a sidewalk area, you want to generally plant it at least 3 feet away from the sidewalk or the walking space, or else people will be walking over the edges of these grasses, or you'll have to trim it back. The flower stems will get kind of trampled and you'll kind of lose that lovely look. One of my very favorite plants. I put it in almost every garden that I am involved with. So questions came in, just a hard cut back every 2 to 3 years was the question. Yeah, hard cut back of the deer grass every 2 to 3 years, not literally to the ground, but like as a tight kind of little mound, maybe about 6 inches tall. So enough to really refresh everything. I generally use a manual hedge shears, just like that kind of like big scissors, nice and sharp, goes pretty quickly. Some people, like when you have a lot of them, the guy who takes care of our garden here, George, he uses a gas-powered hedge trimmer and gets through a lot of them quite quickly and gets a really nice cut on it. And then just down at the base, a little bit of manual work with that manual hedge trimmer to clean it up. Okay, so now those are not all, but a lot of my, the top medium-sized plants I would recommend. There's plenty of other good plants that just kind of narrowly didn't make the list. But that gives you a really good palette to start from. And so with those, those are often going to be the larger kind of woody shrubs, the medium kind of flowering shrubs. Those are going to be a lot of the longer lived parts of the landscape. But with those shrubs, especially because some of them, there's a range of how wide they're going to get. You don't want to put them like right next to a walkway, right next to the sidewalk, right next to the driveway, because you don't want them to be growing over and have to be constantly cutting them back. So in those areas, also for a visual layering effect, we tend to work with smaller plants. So for edges, fill in between the larger plants, and for areas that are full sun, here's the top list. Some of these aren't quite as long-lived, and so they're kind of more accents, but especially on edges in a native or Mediterranean or Waterwise garden, you might mix some of these plants
and then mix some like cobblestone, small boulders, things like that. So it doesn't need to be like just plants all the way down. One of my favorite go-tos for full sun, it can take part shade as well, is red buckwheat. This is a dwarf cousin of all the other buckwheats we talked about, with some similarities, but also quite a different look. Beautiful even when it's not in flower, because it has a top of the leaf that's green, the bottom side is almost white, so nice contrast. But the flower clusters are really something else, pink to almost reddish. And yeah, I just absolutely love this look. They're great along parkways. They can take a little bit of extra water, so I've used them kind of near fruit trees as well. Flowers a lot spring, summer into fall in many gardens. Loved by pollinators and butterflies, larval host plant for butterflies, birds eat the seed. What happens with this plant is that individual plants are often not super long-lived. So you might occasionally only a year, but more often, 2 or 3 years out of the plants that you'll buy at the nursery and put into the ground. However, when you let these flowers dry out and go to seed, like I recommend, some will fall right here, some of the birds will spread, and you will notice, even if you have a mulched garden usually, that you're going to start getting, this time of year is often when you'll notice, little tiny seedlings coming up. And if you want to know if it's a weed or the buckwheat, it looks like a tender, a little bit more greenish, but it looks like the leaf of the buckwheat. Let those grow where they come up, and they will be kind of the replacements. Some will probably be right nearby. Some will be elsewhere in the garden. If you want, you can let those grow up as well. They're easy to pull out if you don't want them, but that's kind of what you're dealing with this is the individual plants aren't going to be long-lived, but in every garden where I've grown it, they kind of become self-replacing. And the ones that grow from the seeds, because they have like that perfect seedling root system where they've never been in a nursery pot going into the ground, often will be a little bit longer lived themselves as well. So that's red buckwheat. It can take full sun. However, it will really thrive and bloom the longest in a place that gets sun most of the day and some afternoon shade, or even in dappled shade. That being said, we do have them in our parking lot at the Waterwise Community Center and some of the like narrow planter beds in the parking lot that get full blasting sun. We get a lot of color off of them. Midsummer, they do tend to look kind of rough, but they're great. And same thing, like I had 3 of them in the full blasting afternoon sun right next to my asphalt driveway. And 2 of the 3 only lasted a year or so. One of them is still doing pretty well, but I'll probably shift away from that over time to something else. Inland, just that full blasting afternoon sun can be a bit much. Full sun in the middle of a garden or away from kind of reflected heat, a little bit better. One that does tend to do better with that reflected heat afternoon sun, but can go all the way to even a little bit of dappled shade. Wouldn't put it all the way into like a true part shade, but a little bit of shade just fine, or morning sun, afternoon shade, is Margarita Bop or Margarita BOP Penstemon. One of my favorite all-time smaller plants, another one that I use in almost every garden that I do, and even grows well in a pot. Good for parkways, along driveways, things like that. Has these brilliant purple to bluish, almost iridescent flower colors. Its photographs don't do the flower color justice. Similar, but a little bit different than the flowers of showy penstemon. This is kind of a smaller botanical cousin of that one. Hummingbirds and pollinators love the flower. Get another larval host plant for butterflies. And that's another one that I've grown with that little bit of, with that significant extra water from fruit trees. And it does well with that. So it can take extra water, just doesn't need a lot of water. So here it is in a pot. Here's that flower close up, but they're even more beautiful in person. Another penstemon, but a true desert penstemon, kind of cousin of it, is firecracker penstemon, Penstemon etonii. This is one that tends to have more of an up season and a down season than the previous penstemon, the Margarita Bop. So it can look pretty rough in the summer, but absolutely on fire in the spring with these beautiful blooms. Can take a little bit of afternoon shade. I've seen these growing natively outside of Las Vegas, but kind of like in slot canyons when I'm hiking. So, gets a little bit of shade and then some sun. Good in parkways, spring to summer flowering. This is another one, kind of like the red buckwheat, where the individual plants might not last more than a couple of years. If you plant, 10 of them, you'll have one or two that might only kind of act like an annual flower, but they will often seed and then continue to come up in the garden. That's what's happening in my yard, and also good butterfly larva kind of plant. For providing nectar and bringing in the adult butterflies, it's hard to do better than this native plant. This is Delamina verbena, and it is a specific selection that's a little bit more compact, a little bit cleaner blooming, or a little bit cleaner looking, and a little bit darker blooming than the true species. So this is the one I normally go for. This is Delamina verbena. It's a California native verbena that gets these beautiful purple flowers a lot of the year, spring through early summer, concentrated, and just flowers are absolutely adored by butterflies for the nectar. Really great plant, really beautiful. It's a little bit bigger than the other perennials that we've mentioned. Normally is about knee high, maybe a little bit taller by about 4 feet wide. However, if it's super happy, I've seen it 5 feet wide, and in my front yard on an area that gets sun, but a little bit sheltered. It's kind of north facing. It's like 6 feet wide. It's the largest one I've ever seen. It will stay looking better more of the year if it is somewhere that gets a little bit of afternoon shade, or even in just like a slight dappled shade. In full sun inland, I think it's maybe not as much the case coastal, but in full sun inland, it definitely will have a kind of down season in the summer. Like it'll look pretty dried out and scraggly, even if it's perfectly happy. That's just a drought adaptation. So if that's going to bother you, put it somewhere farther back in the landscape where you don't necessarily have to see it like right along a walkway every day, but then you can really appreciate it when it's in bloom, because it will then kind of reinvigorate in the fall and look awesome in the spring most of the time. Or if you don't mind kind of the seasonality, I have it right next to a patio space in my backyard. I don't mind. There's things that look jaw-droppingly gorgeous in the summer near it, and the seasonality is just part of what it does. So yeah, that's Delamina verbena, one of my very favorite native plants. Beautiful flower too, as well. This is the one in my front yard. Absolutely gorgeous plant. And then another favorite of butterflies, as well as a lot of beneficial insects, is yarrow. This is a California native plant, also native to many other parts of the world. It is that lacy-leaved plant I mentioned earlier, and it does spread from the roots. So put it somewhere where you're okay with it spreading. It spreads more with more water, and it looks better throughout more of the year with a little more water. In part shade, you can definitely get away with less water. In my front yard in full sun, which is where it is here, if I want to keep it looking good, for example, in Pomona in full sun in the summer, my front yard garden waters every 3 to 4 weeks, even in the hot blasting middle of summer. I don't, in the months where there's any decent rain, I don't water it at all. And the yarrow will live through that, but it'll look really kind of tired. Some of it will die back or go dormant on that irrigation schedule. So kind of closer to, this is an area you can't really see, but you can kind of walk out into just walking on the yarrow, because it can take a little foot traffic. So instead of just having this be like an open mulch pathway, we planted it to yarrow from little 4-inch pots, and it did fully grow in within a little more than a year. And so some of this is like right near our patio where we have some potted plants. And so in the weeks that it doesn't water, every other week or so, when we're watering some of our potted plants on like along the front walk with the hose, just give it a little splash, which really keeps it going. And then this area, for example, like this year, I just wanted to kind of see what'll happen. I really let this go dormant. Some of it did die back. You saw more of the mulch, but then as soon as it cooled off, it all grew right back. You wouldn't ever know that it looked kind of as straggly in the summer. So you can maintain it however you want to your aesthetic. Yeah, and just gorgeous. The flower buds themselves are pretty nice looking. And
and the flowers themselves are absolutely gorgeous. You can get yarrow in different colors. So there's a pink one that is true California native. Some of the other ones that are like the reds and oranges are the same species. They come from Europe, not California, but the habitat benefits, from what I can tell, tend to be pretty similar in terms of who will visit for the nectar. They can take as much water as they get. They will grow from dry to very moist areas. So wet to dry transition zones, fine. At the bottom of a dry stream bed that floods some, absolutely fine. This is the main ground cover under and around the fruit trees in my backyard. I just water for the fruit trees. I don't give them extra water because there's yarrow, but they kind of have formed a living mulch that we just cut back with a string trimmer once or twice a year. And that's just a living green mulch in place. And it really helps compete with the weeds and provides a lot of beneficial insect habitat, including some insects that will eat our aphids and pest insects as well. With irrigation, it will work well in parkways. To do well in a parkway with that full blasting sun from the street, definitely less water than a lawn, but you're probably going to want to water it if you really want it to be looking great and lush year round, about once a week in the summer. And remember that it spreads. So put it, if you want to fill in open areas, that's great. If you don't want to spread, be prepared to pull it. What I have to do in my front yard is about once a year, I just kind of pull it out from some of the areas that it's spreading in. And yeah, that's yarrow. It can definitely grow in up to significant shade. Where you see it locally native in Southern California mostly is like kind of at the dappled shade at the edge of an oak tree. And you won't see it like as thick. It's kind of like a little bit here or there, or in wet areas, it'll really spread. One of my favorite places to use it, and again, if you want it to stay looking kind of like super green and lush year round here, you'd probably hit it with a hose every once in a while when the rest of the area is allowed to go much drier, but is in like the corner of a driveway. Sometimes if you're backing out of a long driveway, you want to keep the sight lines open, so you might not want shrubs. And some people, maybe every once in a while, they drive accidentally over the corner of a driveway where you don't want some of the other perennials, which would not survive that. The yarrow can take some foot traffic. And so if that, tire maybe goes over it every once in a while, it'll be okay. Ladybugs just love, love, love yarrow. A different species of yarrow, when you hear common yarrow, if you just hear yarrow, most often it's going to be this species. There is another species of yarrow that is not native to California. It comes from the Mediterranean. In full blasting sun, this actually will perform better than our native yarrow in most cases. Water once a week to once every other week. Needs full sun though, doesn't really want part shade. It'll grow in part shade, but it just won't really give you the flowering performance that people plant it for. Works well in parkways. We have this in our parking lot as well. But the main difference between this in terms of how you might use it in the design and the other yarrow is that this one doesn't spread. It kind of stays as an individual perennial plant. The flowers are also adored by butterflies and pollinators. Some people love this color. Some people, it's a bit much, so up to you. But in terms of just doing really well in the Southern California landscape, definitely worth mentioning and being on the list. One that doesn't stay as a nice, tidy kind of thing and does tend to spread, is even somewhat aggressively in the garden, but that is just fine with me, is California fuchsia. This is another true local native. There are some different cultivars of California fuchsia, some of which tend to not spread as much, but if you just buy kind of random California fuchsia from the nursery, it is something that will spread both from seed and from roots in the garden, but it's not so aggressive that if you have like woody shrubs near it, like the California buckwheat right here, it's not going to like outcompete the buckwheat. It just kind of fills open spaces. And it's really easy to pull out if it's growing where you don't want to. And then the other tip is if you don't want it to spread, it comes up from seed as well. So when the flowers fade before the seeds really dry out, cut it back hard. The reason why it's planted in the garden is because of, one, visually, all these flowers. The hummingbirds love them, but this one blooms late summer into fall. And so when a lot of the other plants have stopped blooming for their flowering season, this one really comes in the fall and extends that food source for hummingbirds and pollinators. And it gets really leggy and basically dies back every winter. And to really keep it fresh and looking good in the garden, when it dies back in the late fall, early winter, you either cut it all the way to the ground, or sometimes you'll already see like the new next year's fresh growth. If you just have one or two, you can kind of cut it back and just leave that fresh growth. But that really kind of helps reinvigorate it, keep it looking good. You should plan to do that maintenance if you're going to plant it. If you have a total like wild garden, obviously no one's cutting it back in the wild, but it definitely will help in the home garden. Absolutely gorgeous, great for filling in for little edge spaces. In a space like this, it will overgrow the walkway some, but it's super easy to trim back as needed. Another one for full blasting heat, I tend to use this in parkway areas as well, just where you want to turn heat into flowers. This is red yucca, not a California native, but native to the Southwest. And it's great for those full sun areas. It's not a true yucca. It's a succulent type, but it's almost like a thick kind of grass. There's no spikes on it. And it just gets these big clusters of pink to almost reddish flowers and a lot of the heat of the summer. So after some of the native plants that kind of slow down in the summer, like the sages are kind of wrapping up, these will be really kind of doing their thing along with maybe some of the native desert plants. Very different, but another plant that is native to Mexico, but grows very well around here is Santa Barbara daisy. In general, in full sun, it can take full sun to definitely part in dappled shade, especially in full sun. It's going to need a little bit more water than like some of our true native plants will tolerate. So if you're thinking watering once every 3 to 4 weeks, in a lot of native plantings, this is it really will thrive with like every other week. Can take every week, so you can put it in parts of the garden that will get water every week. If it gets part shade, maybe every 3 weeks as well. Can take more water, so it's good in those wet to dry transition areas, good near fruit trees, blooms nearly year round, and lots of little beneficial insects, especially some of those little beneficial insects that will eat aphids and pest insects. Really like this. So it's a great habitat plant for those sorts of insects. It is great along kind of pathway edges. It'll be about 4 feet wide over time. And so it can kind of be used to fill in spaces and can get cut back. And maintenance is really, after it's done with a kind of a spurt of blooming, it'll kind of be looking a little bit, past its prime. Cut it back pretty hard, and it will grow right back. And if you really want to keep it looking great, you do that twice a year, but just once a year is kind of fine as well. Here's the flowers close up. They change color as they get older, so it's this kind of pinkish to white. Another great small utility plant is Berkeley sedge or European gray sedge. These are so closely almost the same plants. One of them is a true native. One of them is from the Mediterranean, that they were totally mixed up in the nursery industry, and then doing some work with a microscope. A grad student realized that they're actually 2 separate species. They're still pretty mixed up in the nursery industry. They do the same thing in the garden. So you might see almost the same plant listed as either of these. And it's this here, it's kept small and cut back some. Here you can see this is my parents' backyard. And here it's spaced a little bit more, and this only gets cut back once a year. They'll get, individual plants will get 2 to almost even 3 feet wide. About a 2-foot spacing is a good average spacing. If you want to get more of like the individual feel of them, you can go a little bit farther, or you can space them closer together and cut them back more often. When you cut them back, it could be done with a small area with a
manual hedge trimmer, but you can use like even a weed whacker or a string trimmer on them as well for more of a lumpy lawn-like effect, like you can see here. Part shade to shade inland, they can take full sun with extra water, but prefer some afternoon shade. In full sun, like in this, my parents' garden as well, most of the year, every other week water, but they will get a little bit kind of yellow golden in the summer. It's kind of their natural reaction if they're in full sun, and then they'll green back up in the fall. Because they can take sun, but they can take pretty much full shade. Like these are one of the few plants that'll do just fine underneath an oak tree, that dark shade. They're great in northern facing areas, or also areas that, you know, flood even. They don't need a lot of water, but they can take all sorts of water. So the area where like all the water pours off your roof, just fine. They are a larval host plant for one type of butterfly, skipper butterflies, and are great, like I mentioned, in that wet to dry transition, and are great underneath trees with a lot of shade and root competition that are generally hard to garden under. And so like underneath an oak tree, because of that leaf drop, I wouldn't do like a solid, almost lawn like this, but I would plant them like here and there and here and there to get that like mound kind of here and there. Looks lovely rather than just having the oak litter underneath. And there's a few other that are good for underneath oak trees as well. There's many lists available for that. Another good ground cover and good at edges, although this will occasionally overgrow the sidewalk and need to be trimmed back, but very low maintenance other than that, is bluefinger. Sometimes called blue chalk sticks, but that sometimes also refers to another similar succulent. Senecio mandrulaceae is the plant, usually called bluefinger. And this is one, it's not a native, it's a succulent, but because it is so good at these edge areas, if you want a real filled in edge with very low maintenance, a lot of even the ground cover kind of shrubs with the natives can get very wide, like 8 feet wide, and so might require a lot of pruning at the edges. And so you see this one mixed in, or in general waterwise gardens and succulent gardens, can take full blasting sun to part shade, low maintenance and relatively long lived. You can actually, if you know someone with these, you can just snap off little cuttings of them, let them dry in the shade for a couple of days so that the snapped off part kind of scabs over a little bit, and just stick them in the ground and they'll root and grow. Here you can see another driveway planting, Mediterranean garden with some California natives, some rosemary, some succulents. Quite lovely for those kind of corner areas as well. So we had one question come in before we transition to hedges, and then we still have, so we're getting from kind of some of the more specific categories now, kind of went through the big ones, the trees, shrubs, little perennial plants at the edge. And now we're going to talk about some special cases. We'll talk about hedges, we'll talk about turf substitutes, and we will talk about what else, that north facing side of the house. So George had a question about yarrow lawns, and I think I'll actually hold that to when we talk about turf substitutes, because definitely have some thoughts to share about using that yarrow plant that spreads as an entire lawn. So for hedges, a lot of waterwise and native plants will not take being turned into hedges, but some will. Hedges, especially if they're clipped, tend to be, quite a bit of work. Not often do homeowners want them right these days, but the larger ones is a barrier. There are situations where it's useful. So if you need a low hedge, there is a coyote brush. So we talked about coyote brush earlier, a small one that's a hybrid of a couple of different species called Centennial. And that one, if you're going to have a hedge that needs to get clipped every once in a while, really tends to be the best one. This is at the Nature Gardens at the LA Natural History Museum. And the reason why is because that stays kind of pretty well filled in low to the ground, which is what you want for a hedge. If you have a large hedge, the coyote brush that we talked about earlier, the big bushy one, can be a fast growing one that does well, but over time it tends to lose its leaves right down at the base and be a little bit more open. So if you try to maintain it as a low clipped hedge, you'll kind of not have enough bushy part to work with. For I already mentioned one of my favorites for hedges is California coffeeberry for like traditional foundation planting. The Eve case coffeeberry will be very doable to have like almost a traditional kind of clipped hedge. And so here we have like a native substitution for a very typical front yard design where we have the foundation planting hedge with the dwarf coffeeberry. And then we'll talk about sedge lawns when we talk about turf substitutes. So just less maintenance, less water, and more habitat benefits, but pretty conventional if that's what you're into. If you need a big hedge, we talked about Catalina Cherry earlier as a big hedge. This is if you really don't do any pruning and let it do its thing for a large area, that's kind of what you could get. And then toyon, we talked about it as a tree, talked about it as a shrub, also works as a hedge. To keep it kind of narrow like this, you would need to do some pruning, but I've definitely planted huge toyon hedges. If you want it to grow in quickly as a hedge, 6 to 7 feet apart would be about the spacing, and it'll get much taller. Easiest to leave it at least 12 feet of depth, but very doable, especially if you don't have a huge long one, to assume it's going to get like at least 5 feet, and then you can do some clipping to keep it there. Howard Mcminn Manzanita, as I mentioned earlier, can take any sort of pruning. And so here you see it. I think I've seen it a little bit more in pictures as a hedge like this in Northern California gardens, but definitely can take that. It just grows pretty slowly. So it's definitely a long-term investment for a hedge where coffee berries and the cherries will do well. If you have a Mediterranean garden and you want like a really clipped kind of formal look, there is a plant called dwarf myrtle, true Mediterranean plant, very tough. That can be either a loose or a formal clipped hedge. Most people these days aren't looking for that. We actually have a dwarf clipped myrtle hedge, which is a lot of work to keep that way and keep it from not growing onto the walkway in our garden. But in the last 5 years that I've been here, I've not talked to one person who's really interested in putting in one for themselves at home. So we're actually about to rip that out this season and have a more informal kind of low hip-high visual barrier working with some other plants. If you want blooms almost year round, color is really important, and you don't mind lots and lots of bees, there is an Australian plant to consider that's very tough called Little John bottlebrush. Bottlebrush is normally thought of as a tree, can be quite a large tree, but there is a shrub that if you plant it every 3 feet apart or so can make a low hedge. It's definitely going to get taller than this, often maintained as a hedge. It'll be about hip high, needs pruning multiple times a year to stay that tall, but definitely can be done. And you see that more and more, where just kind of like general commercial landscapes are going in that direction. Personally, not one of the favorites that I get excited about, but definitely, some people are pretty into it. Keep it in the list. It is, if you want to do that, the pruning is super easy in full sun areas and will bloom almost year round, but absolutely loved by honeybees. So you will have lots of those around. And then I already showed this picture, but just mentioning it, talking about hedges. I'm even a fan of the deergrass hedge. As a hedge, I'll plant deergrass 4 feet apart. So a little bit closer than I will in a landscape, because I want that density for that kind of thigh-high hedge. So those are kind of top hedges as well. The normal, not the island cherry that gets really tall, the normal cherry does really well also. Honorable mention. So moving on, 20 minutes left, but we're making, I think, good progress to get through most of our plant lists. This is one that I always get questions about. North sides of houses, garages, etc. Very shady this time of year, pretty shady a lot of the year, but then full blasting sun when the sun is really high in the summer. Have some good choices for you. California strawberry is also called woodland strawberry sometimes, is a native strawberry plant that you can plant 2 feet apart in the garden, and within a year, if it's happy in the right space, it'll be grown in. It's considered a part shade to shade plant. However, I've grown it in north facing situations. I have it on the north facing side of my house, and after it's established, give it really not much water at all. I just water it along with my other native plants, and it does well even when the sun is high and it's getting hit.
there's enough other shrubs and other things around that this is really filling in the ground cover, and then up against the house in some areas where we don't have other shrubs to kind of get access to the windows and things like that. And it does extremely well. Doesn't need a lot of water, but it can take water. So another good wet to dry transitions. It does have an edible fruit. It is a strawberry, but they are tiny. If you can get them, sometimes they don't taste like much. Sometimes they're very sweet and taste delicious, but the birds are going to eat most of them. They love it. And it does get those nice white flowers if you've seen a strawberry flower before. Good for under canopies of fruit trees as well. In some areas where we don't have yarrow underneath my fruit trees, we have this as the ground cover, and it thrives. Toy on, we've talked about it enough, but the only other thing I'll say is it's great on that north-facing exposure because it can take the sun or it can take the shade. Really close to the house on the north side or the garage, heucheras can do very well, also called coral bells. If they get too much sun inland, they will burn, but they look gorgeous in the spring. So I have some on the north side of my house. They look incredible in the spring. The leaves do get a little bit crispy in the summer, but there's enough other stuff to look at. So it depends. They're also great underneath once like fruit trees are large enough that it's true shade underneath, or even underneath oak trees. They thrive. But if you want to put them in, if you accept the seasonality and want to put them on the northern exposure, you'll get a great spring display. This is my favorite. Heuchera maxima or island alum root has a really kind of complex combination of flower colors. The other ones tend to be more pinks and things like that. This is one called Wendy that does really well around here. And that's kind of nice too. But to me, this is really, really unique and interesting. California fescue. We'll talk about this other meadow grass, but as an accent on the north side of a house, I have them on the north side of my house, smaller bunch grass than deer grass. California fescue does really well, almost a blue colored leaf, really lovely flower. And fragrant pitcher sage. This plant, in terms of its form, is kind of a hot mess. It's stemmy and it's floppy, but this picture doesn't really even do it justice. This is also fragrant pitcher sage, the one I showed at the beginning in my front yard that had the almost glowing leaves. That's fragrant pitcher sage. The form, it just kind of long stems that go wherever they want. But the leaves themselves smell amazing. And the flowers are these beautiful clusters of kind of downward hanging bell-shaped flowers that butterflies and hummingbirds, as well as pollinators, love. Blooms for a lot of the year and can grow from, like I mentioned earlier, full shade to full sun with some water. In our yard, where we don't water a lot, it goes slightly dormant in the summer, not super, super dormant. We could give it extra water and it will go better, but it gets, that's when it's in the full blasting sun, but it just thrives when it's in the shade as well. So a really good one for northern exposures. If it was closer to the house, it would probably go less dormant as well. So those are my top north-facing choices. There's others also, like I mentioned, I didn't put it in again, but the Oregon grape. So the golden abundance for the large, and then the creeping Oregon grape for the smaller ones do amazing in those north-facing areas as well. Sculptural accent plants, just one of this here, one of this there. Deergrass, here it is as a whole kind of meadow in a landscape design I did, but it's great as kind of individual accents as well. From Texas, cousin of deergrass is pink mullygrass. Gorgeous, gorgeous flower. Main bloom is in the fall, sometimes in the spring as well. Kind of like cotton candy flowers. I don't tend to use it as much because it doesn't have as many habitat benefits. And then these flowers do, I'll leave them on in gardens where I use it. And when they dry out and turn kind of tan colored, and they're still lovely, but this really does need an annual cutback because the flowering they do tend to break apart and look kind of sloppy. Aloes as sculptural accents. Aloes, there's lots of different aloes that work as visual accents in a Waterwise garden. Here is coral aloe with these big clusters of orange flowers, and it kind of has that rosette shape. I also love aloe vera as it forms more of a clump instead of individuals, and it has beautiful yellow flowers. And there's a really small one called blue elf aloe that does really well. I will sometimes mix those into otherwise mostly native gardens just for that sculptural form as kind of a break in the form. We just did a planting at the Waterwise Community Center with a lot of natives, but it also has aloe vera and blue elf aloe, as well as the agave I'm going to show on the next slide. Lots of different aloes work well in Waterwise gardens. As long as there's good drainage, very easy to grow in sun or part shade. And they also do help habitat sometimes because most of them will bloom in the winter and the nectar is loved by hummingbirds in the winter. So even though it's not a native plant, it does have a place in the ecological garden. Agaves are another easy sculptural accent. Most agaves are spiky on the end, but one of my favorites is foxtail agave. That's the one that's fully soft. You see it, it's pretty common plant. You see it in a lot of landscapes, but often it's just kind of floating by itself. And I think it's really at its finest when it's used as kind of a sculptural accent in Mediterranean, or sometimes even in a California native landscape where there's a lot of shrubby plants. And then this is just a really beautiful soft accent. Biggest thing I can say with agaves is make sure you have room for the one you're planting. Look up how large it's going to get and know that it's going to get that big. So if it's going to overgrow a sidewalk and cause a problem, don't put it there or move it farther back. A lot of them can take full blasting sun. The foxtail agave can tolerate it, but in inland gardens in full blasting sun, especially in the afternoon, the leaf tips will kind of brown out a little bit, and then the new ones will grow in and look fine. So it just depends on how refined of a look you're going for. After the summer, you can kind of go back and trim off the burnt leaf tips if you want. So getting there, getting through it. Vines. There's not a ton of different vines I'm going to talk about, but there's a few good ones. If you want a vine that will swallow a whole fence or a whole pergola, California grape is one to consider. It doesn't need much water, but it can take as much water as there is. So wet to dry transition areas are fine. It grows natively around here in riparian areas that have water, but in a garden, I have one kind of at the bottom of my garden, kind of swallowing just a very loose framework that we put up to kind of mask a cinder block wall. It gets water maybe once a month, and it does just fine. It can tolerate shade, it can tolerate full sun. It's crazy vigorous. Like it's a vine that's gonna maybe be like 40 feet. You're gonna have to prune it every year. It has tasty, tiny grapes. They're good if you can eat them. It was a pretty big seed, it's not gonna be, they're not like table grapes, but they taste pretty good. Birds will eat a lot of them, but they can attract ants. So I wouldn't put it over a pergola like right outside my house, but I love it down in the bottom of my backyard. And different birds kind of live in the structure of the vines as well. It drops all of its leaves in the winter though, and it needs significant pruning. Like maybe if you're trying to keep it to a specific size, like you might need to cut out like half of it or more every year. But lots of people, including myself, think it's worth it. You can actually grow it in a big pot in a patio area, and we'll stay a little bit more contained. There is one, it's a native grape hybrid. It's a hybrid between a native grape and actually a wine grape that occurred naturally and was found on someone's property. You can, mostly the native nursery sell it though, and it's called Rogers Red Grape. And so the normal grape might get a little bit red, but mostly turns yellow before it drops its leaves. And Rogers Red reliably every year gets this gorgeous red coloring. Other than that, very similar to the native grape. And then if you need an evergreen vine to swallow something, cover something, provide a visual barrier, there are some native ones. Like if you really want to plant a native plant, you can check out Calistegia. It's the morning glory. There's a really lovely one called Anacapa Pink Morning Glory. It's almost like herbaceous. It's not like a long-lived woody kind of vine, and that's lovely for certain things. That's one of my favorites, the morning glory. I should probably add it on here, native morning glory, for like swallowing a chain link fence. These woody vines, both the grape and this, you really need to be careful training up a chain link fence, because if the major branches get into it, it'll both harm the plant and the fence over time as it gets larger, where the morning glory kind of has small, more tender stems that it can grow through. But if you need a big evergreen one, not native, kind of more medium water use, but pretty tough once established, blood red trumpet vine, is super vigorous. It's another one that it'll get like 40 feet, so it might require a lot of pruning, but has abundant flowers in the warm season that are loved by hummingbirds, and it's quite lovely. And so as we get towards the end, some of our last considerations to look at: simple turf replacement, meaning you still want some area where like the dog can run around, or maybe you want to just like sit in a grassy area, maybe lay out a blanket, have a picnic, take a nap every once in a while. Sometimes it's nice to have a little patch of that. One of my favorites for native gardens, both because it's so tough, can take some limited foot traffic, not like soccer every day, but no problem to walk through it. No problem to sit in a little meadowy area. This is what I chose for my backyard for a little space for that, is Western meadow sedge. It's a carex, so it's a grass-like native plant, very vigorous, spreads by the roots. So put it somewhere where it could spread some, or put in some sort of root barrier, but it mostly thrives where there's a little bit of extra moisture. So like for my area where I have it, in the summer, we supplemental irrigate just kind of directly on the carex and leave everything else around it pretty dry. And that tends to help kind of contain it some. Way less water than traditional turf, especially if you're okay with it turning like a little bit golden in the summer. We have 3 turf plots, turf kind of demonstration alternative plots that we replanted just in this last spring in our demonstration garden. They're each on their own irrigation zone. So we've been really tracking how much water. And even in its first year during establishment in full blasting sun, we water this after the first few weeks. Once we can see it starting to spread in, water it about as often, water it once a week, but total water in any given month, like about as much as we would have given like a lavender plant throughout the summer. And it looked awesome. It's thriving. I've been surprised. It's needing less water than it kind of had the reputation for. It has a reputation for being a kind of more moderate water use plant, and it's functioning as a true low water use plant. Especially if it's in part shade, can take even less water. So I let mine in my yard go a little bit golden colored in the summer, and it gets from some nearby shrubs, some definitely kind of considered part shade. I water it like every 2 to 3 weeks, a good deep soak, and it's been doing really well, and then turns green right again as soon as kind of the weather starts to cool off in fall. The more water you give it, the more aggressively it'll spread. And it's also good under fruit trees as part of that, like you can mix in with the yarrow and the strawberry. It tends to be a little more aggressive though. So you can think about how much you want it to spread. Also can totally take flooding. So this area is actually, we dug out a little sunken meadow area. So if our dry stream beds overflow, this is the final lowest part at the bottom of the yard that in a large storm event will fill up with water. But then when it's not raining, it's our little sunken meadow area, which is lovely to hang out in. Probably the most truly drought tolerant and closest to a typical lawn, but you can see it's still going to be sometimes a little bit lumpier, is buffalo grass. This is a southwestern native. Looks similar to a Bermuda grass lawn kind of, but grows a little slower, which means less maintenance. It's another one that I've been watering it about the same as a Western meadow sedge. So even in the first year as like a true native, true low water plant. And I expect that next year we can probably cut back even a little bit more. We're going to try it out, but definitely both of those we're watering in full blasting sun once a week and as a pretty true low water plant. You can mow it or leave it tall, kind of like a meadow. It does go dormant, so kind of turns golden brown in the coldest parts of the winter. But it is like for kids running around on or for the dog, probably the toughest Waterwise grass alternative. However, if you're really having like soccer practice every day or something like that, you're still going to want probably a traditional turf. It probably won't handle that much traffic, but yeah, something for the dog to hang out on, occasional barbecue, having people over should do just fine. This is a large planting of it that does quite well, but this is the color in kind of the winter that you could expect. Here's another kind of smaller lawn area in one of the gardens that was on the California or the Theodore Foundation Native Garden Plant Tour. Here's kind of close up. And then the final one is yarrow, which can be used as a large scale ground cover. That's the third one that we're testing in our turf plot.
And so conclusions are pretty much like I mentioned earlier when I was talking about Yarrow. If you want to use it as a turf alternative, it is going to need supplemental water in the summer. And in full blasting sun in our turf plot, it did need more water to stay looking good as like a kind of dense turf area in full sun than either of the other two that I mentioned. It'll live with the same amount of water as the other two, but because it's more of an herbaceous plant, it'll look kind of like thirsty, kind of weepy, kind of midday, where the other two don't have that look. So if you really want it to perform well in full sun in inland climates, might think about twice a week water, or just know that's going to look weepy midday, but you'll be okay and it'll survive quite well. And it's going to depend on your soil as well. Certainly if you have like really rocky or gravelly soil, I would not probably do a lawn alternative with Yarrow unless it was really in like part shade. But it's loved by pollinators, all the stuff that I talked about earlier on. And so I think with our very last few minutes, good question. What is UC Verde grass? UC Verde grass is buffalo grass, and it's the most common one that's planted these days around here. It's just one of the colleges, I don't remember which one, that was part of the UC system that has an agricultural program, did some study and development, and they just selected a specific naturally occurring strain of buffalo grass that stays a little bit lower and a little bit greener more of the year. That's the one that we actually have in our demonstration garden. So it is just buffalo grass, but it's a specially selected buffalo grass. And so what I'll do now, since we're pretty much at 12, is I'll just mention the last few things in here. There is a last section that talks about some favorite large scale ground covers if you want to download the PDFs. There's a dwarf kind of wide version of coyote brush that can cover a large area with a small amount of plants. There's another sage that I like using for that, and another one that's a little bit lower. There is a plant called Catalina perfume or evergreen currant that does well in dense shade, like underneath oak trees, where a lot of other things don't thrive. And that gets us through all the plants. So we pretty much got there. And then just a note about never planting invasive plants and some ones that you should not plant because they jump out to wild areas and can cause problems in habitat. And then the last important thing that I promised I'd talk about is, where do you get these plants? So if you want to, you can on the same, I'll type into the chat again where you can download all these slides, cbwcd.org/presentations. We also have a local landscape suppliers list that has all of these except for the last one, and I need to update that. I just added it on. But if you are local to our service area, western edge of San Bernardino County, California Botanic Garden has a nursery. You don't need to pay to go into the garden. You can go right from the parking lot, called the Grow Native Nursery. That's going to be one of your best bets, and they have knowledgeable staff that can make great recommendations. Closer to the San Fernando Valley, and if you're really looking for some cool stuff, I'll drive out there every once in a while, even though it's a haul. Theodore Payne Foundation. There's also Tree of Life Nursery in San Juan Capistrano. Amazing, beautiful nursery, gorgeous demonstration plantings. They do free workshops as well. Check out their website and their calendar. Theodore Payne Foundation does a lot of workshops as well, and just gorgeous buildings at the nursery as well. Garrison Foothill Nursery in Upland carries a variety of native and waterwise plants. Their hours are a little bit strange, so definitely check out their hours or maybe even call before you go down there. Even Armstrong Garden Center in Claremont has started carrying more natives, definitely not nearly as many as the specialty places. And they're not going to be able to probably answer as many questions about the natives as the more specialty nurseries. But if you're looking for something, you can check there. And then as you get more towards the LA area, there's some other great nurseries as well. Plant Material is a nursery that has now 2 locations in Los Angeles. Great selection of native and some other waterwise plants, and they really focus a lot on native plants. Lincoln Avenue Nursery in Pasadena has everything, including natives and waterwise plants. Artemisia Nursery in Los Angeles has natives and edibles. And then if you're doing a whole garden project, I always recommend that people try to get their plants from local nurseries. It's important to support our local nurseries, so they'll carry native and waterwise plants. But if you're having trouble finding things, sometimes the local nurseries just don't have everything. And so another service that you can consider using and look into is Plants Express. That's a website. That's basically they have a company where they have a wholesale arm as well, where they supply contractors, and then Plants Express supplies directly to homeowners. And they basically have a network all throughout the state of trucks that are constantly going and picking up orders directly from the wholesale, plant producers all around the place, all around the state. And so you can order online from their catalog of plants that they currently have access to, and they will basically accumulate all the plants you need from all of the different suppliers and deliver them to you. And if it's a large enough order, I think it's over $350, the delivery is free. The only thing with that is, and they pick up from a lot of credible nurseries. I don't know all the nurseries they pick up from, but I know they pick up from a lot of the wholesale nurseries that I buy from, that some of these other nurseries buy from. But since you can't choose your individual plants in advance, like in our selecting or purchasing and planting Waterwise and native plants class, we talk about how do you look at a plant, know if it's healthy, know if it's going to grow well. So if you're ordering online, you can't choose that. But I recently, before I added this on, talked to the business operations manager for Plants Express, and I asked about, so what happens if plants show up and they're overgrown, if they don't look well? And he assured me that, if the homeowner just doesn't like them, they could just say, I'm not going to accept these, keep them on the truck, and they'll get refunded for those that they didn't accept. And that sometimes happens even ordering from like the best wholesale nurseries. Sometimes when I'm getting plant deliveries, I'll have a few things that are just a little more overgrown than I want. Tell them, these are larger than I want. I don't think these are going to grow well, and then just get refunded. So that's just something to know if you consider ordering and doing that online order from Plants Express. But also you learn so much when you go to, especially the local nurseries that specialize in these plants, and you can ask questions and stuff. It's really kind of a nice experience. And you'll see new plants and maybe learn about other ones as well. And thank you for those of you who are a little bit south of where we are. Moosa Creek Nursery in northern San Diego County is another great source of plants. And Debbie put that into the chat. Do they sell directly to the public at Moosa Creek, Debbie? If you know that they do, please let me know. I only knew them as wholesale. But you can definitely check out their website as well, though, because a number of our local retail nurseries, including, I believe now, Glendora Gardens in Glendora, which could also be on this list. They sell Waterwise plants. They distribute Moosa Creek nursery plants. And so Moosa Creek actually now has a downloadable app where you can order directly from the wholesaler, but pick up at the closest retail nursery. And I know San Gabriel Nursery in San Gabriel is one of their nurseries. I've ordered plants through Moosa Creek, but picked them up at San Gabriel Nursery. And I believe Glendora Gardens in Glendora is one of them now as well. And so for those of you who are going to download this, there's just a few other reference slides about choosing young, healthy plants. Most of this is overlapping content that you can also get on the online workshop. Actually, I'll explain from that purchasing and planting Waterwise and native plants, and just some kind of what to expect in terms of the planting and the growing of your plants. But yeah, really for that, check out, especially if you're new to this, I highly encourage you, just I guess kind of to wrap up, to check out either our design for California Native Gardens class, as well as our DIY landscape design class. And definitely check out that purchasing and planting Waterwise and native gardens class. And then there's also an installation and establishment for native and Waterwise gardens class as well. And so those are some of those things I just mentioned. A couple of tips about growing those Waterwise plants, but again, that's all covered in the installation and establishment class. And with that, that's the workshop. I'll leave up these references, some of the other websites and our other resources that I mentioned. And with that, thank you for those of you who have stayed. I know we went a little over. There's just so much information to share, so it's kind of hard to land it at 3 hours exactly. But I will now, I can stay later and answer any other questions that have come in. And I did also launch a closing and evaluation poll. So as I'm answering questions, if you could please fill out just this quick closing poll, I'd really appreciate it. We're always trying to get better at what we do here and be able to serve people better and provide them with the information that they need. So these evaluations are really useful. And there's only so much we can learn from the poll as well. So if you are willing to, in addition to that, I also love to get feedback from the chat. We are often tweaking our workshops to make them better. So if there's anything you learned that you know is particularly useful or that cleared anything up for you that you were missing in terms of your journey of understanding and working with Waterwise gardens or plants, love to know in the chat. Or if there's anything that wasn't clear or that you're hoping to get out of the workshop and didn't, I'd love to hear that in the chat as well, so we can try to do better in the future. And so with that, let's start answering the rest of the questions. So George asked about the UC Verde. Is it a warm season grass? Yeah, the buffalo grass is a warm season grass. To go to the Grow Native Nursery at California Botanic Garden, you don't need to buy a ticket. It's right next to the parking lot and you can go directly to the nursery. They're not open every day. Definitely check their hours before you go. I can't remember off the top of my head which days they're closed. And they also, a lot more nurseries these days will also keep their inventory posted online. So you can check before you go down there what they have in stock. Grow Native Nursery does that. Theodore Payne Foundation Nursery does that. Plant Material Nursery, the one in Los Angeles, does that as well. And some of them, I believe currently Theodore Payne Foundation and Plant Material, you know, if they have it in stock, you can actually like do an online shopping cart and purchase it and then go pick it up. So you're not like having to, you know, if you can't get there for a couple of days, it's not like the plants will be gone by the time you get there. They have limits to how long they'll hold them for, but that's something that you can do. Okay. Let's see. Next question. Okay, from Anne, can I recommend someone to work with in Moreno Valley? Okay, so I don't make specific, like I am presenting from a public agency, so I don't make specific recommendations. However, I can let you know a couple of local landscapers that I believe do both design and installation, who might do a project in Moreno Valley who specialize in this kind of work. So not a recommendation, but just these are a couple that are doing this kind of work with this sort of plants in the area. Definitely check references. If it's a large job and they legally should be contractor, check if they're a contractor, all those sort of warnings. But you might check, they're active around here, kind of, you know, Fontana through Claremont. I know there's a company called Natural Earth Landscapes. There's another company called BAM, B-A-M Landscapes, that's active in this area. I'm not sure if they go all the way to Moreno Valley. And there's just another, there's another company that I just learned about just on Instagram that I think might actually be located out towards Moreno Valley. And that, I believe the name is Gaia, G-A-I-A, Gaia Nativescapes. So you can check those. From Carol, oh, you wish the names of the plants were on the slides. I thought, at least in the plant profiles, I thought the names of the plants were on the slides. I apologize if they weren't. On some of the ones with the general pictures, we are in the process of trying to add more and more names. But yeah, I don't have them all in this workshop. I will try to get that up for next time. Thank you for the feedback. Okay. can I please drop the maintenance link in the chat box regarding large shrubs that grow better, that are better to grow as a multi-trunk? So just, there's not a specific list that talks about that, although I can mention the names of the plants, but the Inland Valley Garden Planner website, which is right there, has the maintenance profiles for each plant. If it is a plant that's in that, like, I'll say, if it's a plant that, if you're looking at the plant and you check the maintenance and it's one of those plants that I see sold as a single trunk tree, but really is better as a multi-trunk because it wants to be a large shrub, like that what we talked about, I generally have typed that out, or I've written that in the maintenance section. So it'd be more kind of the individual plant maintenance. But the ones that definitely I find that true of are the desert willow, the western redbud, and the desert museum palo verde are the three that I mentioned. Okay, last few questions. Okay, someone was asking for the answer to George's question earlier, can the desert willow be trimmed as a hedge plant? Technically, yes, but because it's deciduous and loses its leaves and kind of has an open internal form, it wouldn't be my go-to choice as a hedge plant, because normally I like to do evergreen hedges. So if I need a large hedge that's going to be like the size of a desert willow, I would probably almost go for like a toyon, or for a little bit smaller, like cherry or coffee berry, if it's an 8 to 10 foot hedge, because they're evergreen. From Milo, what kind of mosquito repellent potted plants can I recommend? Okay, so ultimately, if you have a lot of mosquitoes, there are no plants that will solve your issue. That's one of those things that I see that like might be on like an internet list, but if you have mosquitoes, you're going to still have mosquitoes no matter what you put in the pot. That being said, there's a reputation that heavily scented plants, mosquitoes don't like. So, you know, I've heard of people mentioning things like rosemary, lavenders do well in potted plants. We didn't talk too much about them, but like Spanish lavender does well, or even some of like the smaller sages, because they're heavily scented, you can try in a big pot. But ultimately, like I have so many heavily scented plants and all of those plants in my garden. And, you know, if you have mosquitoes, you have mosquitoes. There's just mosquitoes in our whole area now. I've been pretty careful in my yard. Not as bad as some areas where I've lived, but yeah. And then Mark said attracting hummingbirds. He's never had mosquito issues. Certainly attracting, hummingbirds or other small birds. So like, and we'll talk about this if you either sign up for the next time I teach the gardening for birds, butterflies, pollinators, and more, or you can check out the recording on our YouTube page. There are other small birds like around here. One of the main ones is the black phoebe, that are small songbirds that mostly catch little bugs, including mosquitoes. That being said, I have tons of all of those birds in my yard, and we still get some mosquitoes, but far fewer than in some other gardens or other, yards that I used to have, where we still have plants, but not quite as many native plants that also attract the birds for various reasons. So maybe that's part of what's helping, but it's not going to be like you have no mosquitoes at all. There's no silver bullet for that. Okay, from Mark. Great question. What are the best time of year to tour native plant demonstration gardens and botanical gardens? Well, if you are really trying to learn the most, I would say every time of the year, because the plants change and different plants flower. So some plants are flowering in the spring, some plants are flowering in the fall. To see like gardens at their peak of conventional beauty, the most color, sometime in April, probably. That's when like most of the native garden tours, like the Theodore Payne garden tour, is usually in early April, I believe. Most flowers, although things like buckwheats aren't going to be flowering for many months still. The most kind of conventional beauty. However, your garden is not going to look like that year round. No garden looks at the peak of beauty year round. And that's something that's good for kind of first-time gardeners to learn. Like when you see pictures in magazines, or oftentimes like on the internet, especially if they've been professionally photographed, like those gardens, like it's known, what month of the year is it going to have look the best and have the best show? And that's when the photographer comes. And even in those gardens, there's always some plant that's dying or not doing super well, and they just don't focus on that plant when they're taking the pictures. So that's a good time to see it. But also, I really love visiting gardens in July or August, because that is the harshest time of the year to see a garden. Maybe early September, before it's really cooled off at all. It's been dry for months. It's been hot for months. So I love to visit at those times of the year, because the plants that are looking good in those times of year are the plants that are going to pretty much look good year round. And so that's when you can kind of see, well, like some things have gone somewhat dormant. The sages are done with their flowering. So what are they going to look like when they're done flowering? But some of those evergreen shrubs that I talked about that really look good year round are going to be looking great. And so as a gardener who's getting into this, ideally you'll be drawn to, that beautiful, everything looks so good in the spring, but it's good to know like what to anticipate in the summer, because some plants are amazing plants that I love, but they're just going to look a little bit more rough in summer. Summer is, in our area, it's kind of like the ecological equivalent to our winter. Winter, it's easy for plants to grow. It's cool. It's hopefully a little bit rainy. Where the summer is really where the test is. So know how things are going to look in the summer for what to expect. That way, if you decide to plant a plant that goes summer dormant, and there's plenty of great plants that are totally worth it and have their own sort of beauty for sure when they do go dormant in the summer. When some of the plants do turn more shades of golds and browns, there's totally a beauty to that, which is so unique and so lovely. And so that is part of it. But know that, so that if you plant a plant, and then you're doing this for the first few years, you're not upset with how things look, or not thinking that it should look different, even if you see the beauty in it. You're not worried that the plant is stressed. So go in the middle of summer, and then go again in the fall, and then go in the winter. One of the great things about native and waterwise gardens is just how dynamic they are. So they should look different every part of the year. So that was a very long answer, Mark, but that was such a good question that I think I don't mention enough in my workshops. So yeah, definitely. I love going to gardens in the harshest part of the summer, early in the morning, or sometimes like California Botanic Garden has summer hours where they stay open late in the evening, and see how things look in the summer also. Okay. From George, have I seen the darter moth outbreak in Southern California? I have not. He said that there's one due to the monsoon this summer. Moisture has not been our issue in Southern California, other than the total lack of it. Okay, so that's been causing problems with the Palo Verdes. No, we have not seen that at all. Okay, Debbie, how about laurel sumac? I picked up a few at Theodore Payne. Very beautiful foliage, fast growing, need a privacy hedge that goes quickly, not in the pathway or anything. Really can fill in spreads nicely. Absolutely. Okay, so that laurel sumac is, I would say, like one that, I could only put so many different plants in this. I already pretty much ran out of time. So there are evergreen, fast growing. Laurel sumac, definitely. And you also see in areas where you see laurel sumac, sugar bush, or sometimes lemonade berry. All of those absolutely do very well. Sugar bush and lemonade berry really take pruning very well. Laurel sumac I've never seen as a really like prune to keep it a certain amount of width, but certainly if you have the space for it to grow as wide as it needs to, which for laurel sumac could be 12, 15 feet over time, that could be great. One thing to know about laurel sumac is, depending on where you are, is laurel sumac can actually be pretty frost tender, where some of the other, like the sugar bush and lemonade berry, that are kind of like distant cousins of laurel sumac, look a little bit different, but are all kind of local native chaparral plants. They can take a little bit more frost. The laurel sumac, you might see it growing in places like some of our canyons and foothills that get a little frost, but if it is, it's kind of on a slope, or it's kind of perched up on rocks or things like that, which is kind of keeps them out of the frost. So Yeah, but yeah, absolutely awesome plants. We have, so there are some like raised kind of funky block planters in full western blasting sun, up against a cinder block building, kind of outside the entrance to our facility. And I have laurel sumac in one, sugar bush in one, lemonade berry in one. If they're all planted closer together, they could just be a hedge, and they all thrive. So Mark, at 3,000 feet in zone 9B, which freezes in the winter, does the garden planner address zones? We don't really talk about frost and zones. You might catch some things here and there, but really, so we're a public agency with a tax-based funding, kind of in our local kind of inland empire edge of San Bernardino County Valley areas. And so that's ultimately what it was developed for. A lot of the information is useful for other places, but we didn't really develop it to cover other areas other than how it does. So I would say if there's plants that you're interested in, also look in other areas. A great resource if you're interested in native plants is Calscape, which is a project of the California Native Plant Society. There is, some people have told me that they feel like the website's a little bit intimidating because there's a lot of information that comes up, but it's really interesting information. I use it as a more in-depth resource, and also one that has way more native plants than the Inland Valley Garden Planner. Inland Valley Garden Planner was developed for general gardeners. So we have like 120 something native plant profiles, kind of the easiest stuff to be successful with. Calscape has tons. I think it's just calscape.org. And there you have a few things. For the full database, you can also put in your zip code. So it will only give you plants. There it focuses on plants that were actually locally native to your area. But they also have something new that gives you a little bit more of a simplified search result list called the Calscape Garden Planner, which is worth checking out, where you put in your zip code and you answer another few questions. And so that would be an easy way to, you can look at the Inland Valley Garden Planner if there's things you want, check out Calscape, and you'll get some overlap. Or you can just do the Calscape thing, and then maybe you'll get some other, like there's more maintenance information or things like that on Inland Valley Garden Planner. So you might use them in tandem. Okay. Okay, two last questions, and then it's almost 12:30. There's still a lot of you here. Thank you so much for staying and being so engaged with all the question and answer. Okay, I have a 4-foot wide bed that I need to plant a hedge to grow 15 feet high fairly rapidly. I was thinking of Italian cypress. Is there a good native equivalent? Ooh, 4 feet wide and 15 foot tall is pretty tough. And if you're in, I would say be careful with Italian cypress. It has, it'll grow. It will do that. But if you're at 3,000 feet, if you're in an urban wildland interface area at all, Italian cypress in wildfire zones are also sometimes called Roman candles, because they catch and they just go up. So 4 foot wide is tough. I don't know. Someone else might type in with a good solution. My go-to for a 15-foot high rapid hedge, at 3,000 feet, I think Toyon would still grow there, would maybe be Toyon. But you're not gonna be able to keep that to 4 feet wide. 4 feet wide is really narrow. I'll keep thinking about it in the back of my head. If something comes up to me, I will let you know. If it happens to be an area that gets a lot of water, like if it's near a creek or something, I would consider alder, but that needs a lot of water. Yeah, that's a tough one. So there's a question. Kind of related to more technical. Are all plants today classified as very low or low water for wucols, which is a technical kind of water kind of thing for plants. Yes, other than maybe blood red trumpet vine. I think everything else is either classified as low, or if you happen to see it classified as medium, I know just from practical experience that it does grow on a low water regime. So in my opinion, should be classified for low. And that should definitely be for region 3, because we're in region 4 where it's even hotter, I believe. I don't think region 3 is the desert. Okay. I think that is it. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for all the great questions. And definitely, if you don't get our newsletter, sign up for our newsletter, link here at the bottom, so you get all of the up-to-date stuff on all of our resources and programs, and hope to talk to you in future workshops, see you in the demonstration garden, and see some of you who are local back when we start our in-person workshops again in the new year. Have a great rest of your weekend, everybody.